The day I moved my family into my dead father's cabin was a Tuesday. I remember that specifically because Ethan kept saying he was missing baseball practice for the second week running, and I kept saying I'd make it up to him, and I never did get around to doing that. We pulled off the county road at around 11 in the morning. The drive up from Atlanta had taken most of the previous day. We'd stopped at a motel outside of Gainesville because Lily got carsick on the mountain switchbacks and threw up on the back seat, and Donna cleaned it up without saying a word to me, which was its own kind of communication I'd learned to understand over 15 years of marriage. The cabin is in the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 40 minutes up a logging road from the nearest town, which is a place called Hatchet Creek. Population 400 and some change. A gas station that also sold worms and lottery tickets. A diner that was only open Thursday through Saturday. A hardware store run by a man who seemed personally offended when you asked for anything he didn't stock. The logging road itself was technically a county access road, maintained badly, the kind where your back fillings loosen on the washboard sections, and the mud can grab a tire and just hold it like a decision you regret. My father had lived up there the last 9 years of his life. He bought the cabin when my mother left, and he needed somewhere that felt like it belonged to him only, which I understood better at 38 than I had at 29 when he'd actually done it. The place was built in the 1940s. 2 bedrooms, a loft, a kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a main room with a fireplace, a covered porch that looked out through the hemlocks toward a ridge that turned orange in October. He'd added a generator shed, reinforced the porch posts, put in a proper septic system, and done approximately nothing else to it in the 9 years he'd lived there. The roof was soft in one corner. The water system was a gravity-fed setup from a spring up the hill that worked fine when the pipes weren't frozen or clogged, which my father had apparently considered an acceptable state of affairs. I'd spent 3 weeks in August before we moved finalizing the paperwork with his estate lawyer, a sunburned man named Garvey, who kept a dying ficus in his office and seemed to regard it as a personal failing. The cabin was the only thing of real value my father left. Everything else went to cover what he owed. I'd cleaned out his belongings in 2 days. It didn't take long. He hadn't accumulated much, and I'd made the decision to move the family up there without fully consulting Donna about it, which was another item on the list of things I should have handled differently. But Donna was tired, not just regular tired, the kind of tired that gets into a person and makes them look slightly different in the eyes, like something behind them has moved back a little to conserve energy. We'd been in Atlanta 4 years. I'd been doing contract security assessments for a private firm, which paid well and which I was competent at, and which I could feel myself getting worse at every year in ways that were hard to explain. Donna taught 3rd grade at a school 20 minutes from our apartment, and she loved it. But the commute was brutal, and the neighborhood we could afford wasn't the one she'd wanted, and we'd had the same fight about buying somewhere versus renting at least a dozen times. Ethan was 12 going on 13, and had developed the particular kind of resentment that age produces. Not at anything specific, just a general ambient friction with existing. Lily was 7 going on 8 and was fine, mostly. Except she'd started waking up at night and coming to our room, and I could hear Donna dealing with it. Getting up, taking her back to her room, because I slept through most of it, which was not something I was proud of. The cabin was my idea. Technically, it was inherited necessity. I didn't have the money to maintain it from a distance, so either we moved into it, or I sold it, and I wasn't ready to sell it. My father had built a life there that looked from the outside like retreat, and looked from close up like something more deliberate than that. I wanted to see what that felt like. I also wanted to get Donna out of that apartment and give us something that felt like a fresh start, or failing that, something that felt like a project we could do together, which is what relationships become after 15 years, whether you acknowledge it or not. So that was the setup. Tuesday morning, 11 o'clock, my truck pulling the trailer with the last of our furniture up the final quarter-mile of logging road. The mountains were doing their early September thing, still green on the lower slopes, the ridge above already going gold in patches, the air 10 degrees cooler than Atlanta, and smelling like something that was almost the opposite of Atlanta. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered from August. Donna got out of the truck and stood in front of it for about 5 seconds without saying anything. Lily was already running toward the porch. Ethan looked at his phone, discovered he had no signal, and held it up at different angles, like maybe he'd find a pocket of reception somewhere in the general vicinity of the hemlocks. "Okay," Donna said. Not yes or no, just okay, which I decided to take as neutral. I'd brought my tools. 2 full boxes. Good ones. I'd been a park ranger for 5 years before I'd taken the security job, which meant I knew how to do basic construction, basic plumbing, basic electrical work, in the kind of environments where you didn't have the option of calling someone. The roof was the priority. The corner above the loft had a soft spot about 2 feet square, where the sheathing had rotted through, and with winter coming, that was going to be a problem that got bigger fast. I'd bought roofing felt and shingles in Hatchet Creek the previous August, and left them in the generator shed, along with a new section of corrugated steel for patching, some lumber, and a bag of 16-penny nails. While Donna and Ethan unloaded the trailer and Lily supervised by carrying items that were too small to need carrying, I got up on the roof with a pry bar and started pulling the damaged section. The view from up there, I'd forgotten. You could see the ridge to the east, and below that the way the valley floor opened up about 3 miles down, and on a clear day you could see the smoke from Hatchet Creek. Not smoke like a fire, just the general haze of town, the aggregate of cooking fires and generators, and car exhaust that says people live here. The morning was clear, the smoke was visible. The forest on the north slope had gone quiet in the way mountain forests go quiet around 10 in the morning. The birds settled, the wind light, just the occasional creak of trees and my own work sounds. I replaced the sheathing, laid the felt, nailed down the patch. 3 hours. My back hurt. The nails were a smaller head than I'd have liked for the pitch of that section. And twice, I drove one crooked and had to pull it and reset. Practical small failures, the kind that don't matter. Down below, I could hear Donna moving things around in the kitchen. The sound of cabinet doors, the specific hollow knock of an empty pantry shelf, then nothing for a while. Then Lily asking where the bathroom was, which made Ethan laugh for the first time in about 200 miles of driving. I came down off the roof at about 2 in the afternoon, and Donna handed me a sandwich, peanut butter, because that's what we had, and a cup of coffee from the old percolator my father had kept on the wood stove. We stood on the porch, and I ate the sandwich, and Donna looked out at the hemlocks. "The water pressure is low," she said. "Spring feed. I need to check the intake pipe. There's probably a leaf jam. Ethan's room smells like mice. I'll put traps out tonight. It's not bad, just the smell. The mice clear out once someone's living there." Lily already put a name tag on her door. She put a name tag on her door. She made one from a piece of cardboard in the truck. It says Lily's room in red marker with a flower. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just drank the coffee. It was too strong, which was exactly how my father made it, and I hadn't thought about that until right then. That afternoon I traced the water line up the hill, about 80 feet of black poly pipe that ran from the spring box through the woods and down through a buried section to the cabin's pressure tank. The spring box was a concrete enclosure about the size of a bathtub sunk into the hillside, with a screened intake at the bottom and an overflow pipe and a hinged lid. The screen was packed with decomposed leaves and something that might have been a dead salamander, and once I cleaned it out, the pressure in the cabin went from a dribble to something actually functional. Small win. By evening we had the trailer unloaded, the bedroom furniture placed, the kitchen organized as well as we could organize it given what we had. Donna made pasta on the propane camp stove because I hadn't yet figured out how the wood-burning stove vented properly, and we ate at the kitchen table, which was my father's old table, and nobody said anything particularly meaningful. Ethan ate fast and went to his room. Lily talked about the salamander I'd described finding in the spring box and expressed concern for it by name. She'd named it Gerald before she'd ever seen it. And Donna and I made eye contact across the table in that way that means we're both thinking the same slightly helpless, fond thing about our child. That night I went out to check the generator. My father had a propane setup, a 500-gallon tank buried in the yard, connected to the generator and also to the kitchen range and the backup heat system. The tank was about 60% full, which I knew from August, and the generator started on the second pull. I checked the oil, checked the connections, killed it. We weren't going to run it except for necessity, until I understood the fuel situation better. The night was cold, not freezing, but the kind of cold that reminds you that altitude is real, and that September in the mountains is not September in Atlanta. I stood in the yard for a few minutes. The sky was, I don't have a better word for it, excessive. Too many stars. The kind you can only see when there's no light competing with them. And standing under it after 4 years of Atlanta felt slightly vertiginous. My phone had no signal. The nearest cell tower was in Hatchet Creek, and the terrain ate the signal before it reached the cabin. My father had a landline, an actual landline, a real telephone on the kitchen wall, connected to a line that ran along the logging road to a junction box at the county road. I'd checked it that afternoon. Dial tone. Good. I went back inside. Donna was already in bed. I got in beside her, and she was facing away from me, which told me nothing one way or another. You okay? I said. Tired. Tomorrow I'll get Ethan to help me check the fence line on the north side. There's a section my dad mentioned in a letter that needs new posts. And I want to find where he stored the extra firewood. He mentioned a lean-to up the hill, but I didn't see it in August. Nate. Yeah. Can we just sleep? We slept. That was the Tuesday. That was the 26 hours before everything, which at the time was just Tuesday. A first night in a new place. The kids settled, more or less. The roof patched. The water running. 40 minutes from the nearest 400 people, none of whom I knew, in a mountain that was doing its slow autumn thing, with complete indifference to whether we were there or not. I've thought about that night a lot, whether I slept well or not. I did, actually, better than I had in months. The quiet wasn't like Atlanta quiet, which is just a reduced volume of constant noise. This was different. This was the actual absence of anything human-made, which has a texture to it that you stop noticing when you've lived in cities long enough, and then notice all at once when it returns. I slept. Nothing outside was wrong yet. By morning, it was. The first sign I noticed was the birds. I was up at 6:30. Habit. I went out to the porch with my coffee, the percolator again, my father's recipe, still too strong, and I was watching the light come across the ridge when I realized I couldn't hear anything. Now, I need to explain something about mountain forests in early September. They're not loud exactly, but they're not silent either. There are always woodpeckers, especially in the dead hemlocks we had on the north side. There are always chickadees, always the distant, intermittent sound of something moving through undergrowth. Squirrels, the first crows of the morning, whined through the canopy. It's a specific ambient sound that I'd grown up around during my ranger years, and that I'd stopped hearing consciously, the way you stop hearing traffic in a city. It was gone. Not just quiet, absent, like someone had turned a dial all the way down. I stood on the porch and listened for about 10 minutes, and the forest gave me nothing. No bird sound, no rodent sound, no wind, just the creak of the porch boards under my weight, and the sound of my own breath. I told myself it was because we'd moved in yesterday. The disturbance of unloading, the new smells, maybe the dog we'd brought, though actually we didn't have a dog. We'd lost ours the previous spring. I mention it because my brain went to that explanation first. New presence in the area. Local wildlife goes quiet. It happens. I went back inside and made eggs, and called the kids for breakfast, and the morning proceeded. Around 9, I drove the truck down to Hatchet Creek to pick up a few things I'd forgotten. Some weather stripping, a new gasket for the water pressure tank, couple of extra propane cylinders. The drive down the logging road took about 15 minutes, and the county road into Hatchet Creek another 25. I drove with the window down. The mountains were doing fine. Whatever silence had been up at the cabin didn't extend to the lower elevations, or if it did, I couldn't tell. In town, I stopped at the hardware store first. Wendell, who ran it, was behind the counter watching something on his phone. He looked up when I came in, recognized me from August, gave me the kind of nod that small-town hardware store owners give to people who've demonstrated they know what they're buying. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Need some weather stripping and a pressure tank gasket. 5/8. Aisle 2 for the weather stripping. Gaskets I keep behind the counter. He turned back to his phone for a second, then seemed to consciously put it down. You're the one moved into Walt Calloway's place. He was my dad. Wendell nodded. Good man. Didn't come in much, but when he did, he bought the right stuff, which was maybe the best epitaph I'd heard. I got what I needed. At the gas station, I filled the truck and went inside for the worm and lottery ticket store portion and picked up some basics. Canned goods, coffee, a couple boxes of crackers, dried beans. Not because I was particularly thinking about supplies, but because the pantry situation in the cabin was sparse, and I was planning to do a proper grocery run to the bigger store in Ellijay the following day. The gas station attendant, a young woman, college age, with a name tag that said Brit, was watching something on her phone too. I didn't pay attention to what. I paid for my gas and my groceries and drove back. It wasn't until that evening that I found out what they'd both been looking at. Donna had the radio on. My father had a battery-powered shortwave radio that he kept on the kitchen shelf between a jar of dried beans and a copy of an old Peterson's Field Guide to Birds. She'd turned it on for company while she worked on setting up the bedroom closets, and she'd happened to land on a news station out of Atlanta. I came in from splitting firewood I'd found in the lean-to up the hill. It was stacked there, good dry hardwood, maybe 2 cords, my father's work. And Donna was standing in the middle of the kitchen with a dish towel in her hand, and a look on her face that I hadn't seen since the morning her sister called from the hospital. There's something happening in Charlotte, she said. What kind of something? She pointed at the radio. I listened. The broadcaster, a woman's voice, calm the way news voices are trained to be calm, was describing what she called multiple reports of violent attacks near the downtown area of Charlotte, North Carolina. She was careful with words. She said, reportedly a lot. She said the National Guard had been deployed in a precautionary capacity. She said travel was being discouraged in the affected neighborhoods. She said authorities were asking the public not to speculate about the nature of the attacks until official information was available. She said people were dead. How many? I said. They haven't said a number, Donna said. They just keep saying multiple. I turned the radio volume up. Lily came in from the porch, and Donna put her hand on her head in that automatic way, the small weight of reassurance. Ethan came in from his room, lured by the change in the kitchen's atmosphere. The 4 of us stood around my dead father's radio and listened. Over the next hour, the story changed shape several times. Charlotte first, then a separate report from Columbia, South Carolina, then something out of Roanoke, Virginia, which wasn't connected geographically in any way that made sense. The broadcaster stopped saying, reportedly, and started saying the events were confirmed, though she didn't say confirmed by whom. The National Guard presence in Charlotte had expanded. There was a mention of CDC involvement. There was a mention of quarantine. That word, quarantine, was the first time the shape of it changed for me. Not a fight or a shooting or even a riot. Quarantine was a different category. I told Donna to keep the radio on and went out to the porch. The forest was still silent. 7 p.m. now, the light going amber through the hemlocks. And still nothing. No evening birds. No bats coming out early. The far ridge was a dark shape against a sky that had gone the color of an old bruise. I'd been a park ranger. 6 years in the Chattahoochee-Oconee National Forest, which is mostly low to mid-elevation terrain, but with enough altitude variation that you learned to read the forest by what wasn't there, as much as by what was. A silent forest in the evening could mean a few things. A large predator nearby. Bear, mountain lion, a fire somewhere upwind, animals already moving away from it, or something that disrupted the normal activity patterns enough that everything else went still. I didn't see any smoke. The air didn't smell like fire. I went back inside and told Donna we were going to stay home tomorrow instead of driving to Ellijay. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said what we were both probably thinking, which was that we'd been in this cabin for barely 24 hours, and something was already going wrong with the world outside it. The radio stayed on all night. By midnight, the reports had stopped being about individual cities and started being about corridors. The I-85 corridor, the I-77 corridor, phrases like spreading pattern that the broadcasters seemed to use and then flinch away from. By 2 in the morning, the Charlotte broadcaster had been replaced by someone else, a man with a less trained voice, who said Charlotte's primary broadcast station had gone to emergency protocols and that he was relaying from a secondary location. By 4 in the morning, the Atlanta station was carrying something that it identified as a FEMA emergency alert. I didn't sleep. Donna came out of the bedroom at about 3, and she didn't say anything, just put her hand on my arm for a second, and then went to the kitchen and made coffee. We sat at my father's table and listened to the radio. And somewhere in the middle of that, Ethan came out of his room with his hair wrong and his eyes red from either sleep or not sleep, and he sat down too, and none of us said the thing that was obvious. The reports were describing people attacking other people, not rioting, not gang violence, not anything that fit the normal categories. The description that kept appearing, worded differently each time, but arriving at the same picture, was of individuals who had sustained serious trauma or obvious physical damage, continuing to move and act aggressively. People who should have been incapacitated or dead. Bites, multiple bites, people bitten and then themselves, hours or a day later, becoming part of the attacking group. No one on the radio said the word zombie. They said infected individuals. They said atypical behavior. They said severely compromised cognitive function. They said these things in the careful language of official crisis communication that is designed specifically to communicate the maximum amount of information with the minimum amount of panic. And the panic was there anyway, underneath every sentence, because any adult with functioning pattern recognition could hear what the words were dancing around. Ethan said it, not us. Around 4:30 in the morning, he looked at me across the table and said, "Dad, are those zombies?" "We don't know what they are," I said, "but that's what it sounds like." "I know." He was quiet for a minute. Then, "Are we safe up here?" "Yes," I said. "We're 40 minutes up a logging road. We have water. We have food for now. We have a generator. Nobody knows we're here except Wendell at the hardware store. What if they come up here? Then we deal with it." It wasn't a satisfying answer, but it was the only accurate one I had. Wednesday started with smoke. I saw it around 8 in the morning from the roof. I'd gone up to check a section of the patch I wasn't sure about, and I looked south toward the valley, and there was smoke. Not the ambient haze of town I'd seen Tuesday. Real smoke. Dark, a column of it, rising from somewhere near Hatchet Creek, or possibly from the main road below Hatchet Creek. Too thick for a controlled burn, the wrong color for a chimney fire. I stayed on the roof and watched it for about 10 minutes. It didn't dissipate. It just built, column going higher, spreading into a vague darkness at altitude. I came down and told Donna, and she didn't say anything, but went and checked on the kids. The radio had gone quiet on the Atlanta frequency around 6 in the morning. Not static, just silence, which was different. I found a signal from a station in Knoxville that was still broadcasting, though the quality was poor. They were reporting on events across the southeast, as if they were reporting from a different country. Careful, distance in the voice. The Knoxville broadcaster said travel on Interstate 75 southbound was now being explicitly discouraged by state emergency management. He said the National Guard was establishing checkpoints. He said people should shelter in place. At 9:30, someone knocked on the cabin door. I had my father's shotgun by that point. I should explain that. My father kept 2 guns at the cabin, a 12-gauge pump-action Remington 870, which any person who knew guns would recognize as a completely reasonable thing to own if you lived alone on a mountain, and a 12-gauge pump-action. 30-06 bolt-action rifle, which was for deer, and which he'd apparently been going out every November for 9 years and coming back empty, because there were no hunting tags in his things and no deer in his freezer when I'd cleaned it out in August. The shotgun was in the closet in the main room. The rifle was in a case under his bed, which was now Ethan's bed, which I hadn't told Ethan about. I had the shotgun in my hand when I answered the door. The man on the porch was about 50. Flannel shirt, dark jeans, work boots with the laces broken and retied in the wrong order, the way people's shoes look when they've been walking a long time, and the mechanical details have stopped mattering. He had a cut on his forehead that had dried brownish across his eyebrow, and he was breathing like he'd been climbing. Which he had been. "Please," he said. That was it. Just that. His name was Dale Whitfield. He was from Hatchet Creek, or near it. He'd lived on a farm about 2 miles outside of town that his grandfather had built, and his family had run in different capacities for 70 years. He'd been at his kitchen table when his neighbor came to the door. He described his neighbor, a man named Terry who he'd known for 30 years, as not himself. He said Terry had something wrong with his eyes and wouldn't answer when Dale called his name. He said Terry had grabbed his arm and he'd gotten away and he'd run out his back door and into the woods, and he'd been walking uphill for... He looked at his watch, which wasn't there. He'd lost it somewhere. He thought maybe 4 hours. I looked at his arm. "Can I see where he grabbed you?" I said. Dale pulled up his sleeve. There was bruising on his forearm, finger-shaped, but no break in the skin, no bite. I looked at it for longer than was probably polite. "Did anything break the skin?" I said. No, I pulled away. I wasn't real calm about it. I looked at him. He looked back at me. He had the eyes of a man who was telling the truth about being scared, which is a specific look that's hard to fake and easy to recognize. I let him in. Donna made him coffee and he sat at the kitchen table with both hands around the mug and shook for a little while without shaking, if you know what I mean. Not physically trembling, but with the kind of internal vibration that happens when your body is still processing an excess of adrenaline. Lily watched him from the doorway with the frank scientific interest of an 8-year-old studying something new. Ethan sat across the table and watched his phone, which still had no signal. Dale told us what he'd seen on the farm road and in the lower part of town, when he'd passed through the edge of it. He didn't know what the right word was. He kept saying like something was wrong with them, and they weren't acting like people. He said there'd been a car accident on the county road. 2 cars, like a fender bender. But one of the people from the cars was in the ditch and not moving in the way a hurt person would move. And 2 other people were... He stopped, started over. He said there were people doing things to that person that he didn't want to say in front of Lily. I told Lily to go to her room. She did, reluctantly, dragging one foot. I asked Dale about Hatchet Creek proper, about Wendell, about anyone else he'd seen getting out. "I don't know," he said. "I just ran. I saw your road sign. I've drove past it for years. I knew someone lived up here. I just came up." He was looking at my shotgun, which I'd set against the wall when I let him in. "You got more shells for that?" he said. "Yeah." "Good." We put Dale in the loft room, the one that wasn't a bedroom, the one with the old couch and my father's boxes of books and a view from the single window toward the logging road. I gave him a blanket. He didn't sleep. I know, because I didn't sleep either, and I was up at 2 in the morning checking the porch, and I could see the thin strip of light under the loft door. That was Wednesday. By Thursday, we had 3 more people. They came up the road in pairs and alone, the way water finds the high ground first when flooding starts. Not because they knew where they were going, but because going up was instinct, away from the valley, away from the roads that were filling with the wrong kind of movement. Tom Prater, who'd been a middle school science teacher in Ellijay before last week, and who had the very specific expression of a man whose framework for understanding the world had ceased to apply, arrived Thursday morning with his wife, Brenda, and a backpack that had 2 days of food and a first aid kit in it, which made him immediately useful in a way he didn't seem to recognize about himself yet. Tom and Brenda had driven up from Ellijay, gotten their truck stuck on a switchback about a mile below the cabin when the road turned to mud, and walked the rest of the way. Brenda had a bad knee. She wore a brace, the kind athletes use, and climbed the slope without complaint, but with her jaw set in a way that meant she was managing something. She didn't talk much those first days. Tom talked enough for both of them, which I think was his way of managing his own fear. He'd been a science teacher. He wanted to categorize, to understand, and the information he had was too incomplete to categorize, and the thing he was trying to understand was categorically outside the frameworks he knew. Then on Thursday afternoon, a man named Russell Greer arrived. I want to tell you about Russell Greer carefully, because Russell is important to this story in ways that weren't immediately obvious. He was 54, built like a man who'd spent most of his life doing physical work and about 5 years doing something that required a different kind of endurance. Lean, with ropey forearms and the kind of skin that's been in outdoor weather in every season. He had a beard, not the kind people grew during COVID because they were bored. The other kind. The kind that was just there because he hadn't decided to remove it in a decade. He wore camo pants and a canvas jacket, and he had a hunting pack that looked expensive and organized. He arrived with his wife, Patricia, Patty, and their adult son, whose name was Boyd. Boyd was 22 and didn't say much, and had the look of a young man who'd been told what to think about most things for so long that he'd stopped having his own opinions and was now waiting to be told what to think about this. Russell Greer came up the logging road carrying a rifle in his hand, not over his shoulder. He arrived at my porch and looked at me like he was assessing something, and then he put his hand out and said, "Russell Greer, I've got 2 others with me, and enough supplies to be an asset rather than a drain." He said it exactly like that, asset rather than a drain. Like he'd thought about the sentence on the way up. I shook his hand. "Nate Calloway, this is my family's cabin." "I know. I've known Walt Calloway since before you were posted up here, I'd guess." "You knew my father?" "Hunting club, different one than his. But we crossed paths a few times. Good man. I'm sorry about him." He said it quick and sincere, and moved on. "What's your supply situation?" I told him about the propane tank, the water system, the food we'd stocked. I told him about the generator and the firewood. I told him about the people I'd already let in. Dale in the loft, Tom and Brenda in the second bedroom, which meant my family had compressed into the main bedroom. 4 of us in a room meant for 2. Russell nodded at all of it. Then he said, "Who's in charge here?" I looked at him. "I am. It's my cabin." He held my eyes for a second. Then he nodded. "Fair enough." He put his rifle over his shoulder. I showed them where they'd sleep, which was the main room floor on sleeping bags they'd brought, and I made introductions, and Russell did the same thing with each person. The assessing look, a firm handshake, a specific question about what they knew or could do. He found out Tom had been a science teacher and asked him specifically whether he had any medical training, which Tom did not, but which made Brenda mention that she'd been an ER nurse for 8 years before her knee had forced her into clinic work, and Russell looked at her like she'd just become more valuable, and she noticed him doing it and looked away. I wasn't sure what to do with Russell Greer. I wasn't sure about him at all in those early days. He was competent and organized and genuinely helpful, and there was something about him that I kept circling around and couldn't identify. It took me a few weeks to figure out what it was. But I'm getting ahead. Let me tell you about the road first. On Friday, 3 days after we'd arrived, 2 days into the radio reports, 1 day after Tom and Brenda and the Greers showed up, I blocked the logging road. I'd been thinking about it since Wednesday. The cabin sat at the end of the road, which was a good thing in terms of isolation. But the road itself was passable by any vehicle with decent ground clearance. And increasingly, I was thinking about who else might come up it, and whether they'd all be Dale Whitfield, scared and unarmed and honest about it. In the generator shed I had a come-along, 50 feet of chain, and a general sense of how logging operations worked from my ranger years. There were several large fallen logs in the tree line, about a quarter-mile down from the cabin, a section where a storm the previous winter had knocked down 3 good-sized white oaks, left them lying in a rough pile off to the side of the road. With the truck and the come-along, I moved 2 of those logs across the road, end to end, and staked them in place with rebar I'd found in the generator shed. Not a wall, not a gate, just 2 logs across a dirt road, maybe 18 inches high at the highest point. Not impassable on foot, not impassable with enough vehicle and determination, but a clear signal that the road was closed, and an obstacle that would slow anyone down and give us time to hear them coming. Russell helped me with the second log without being asked. He knew how to run the come-along, and he didn't talk while we worked, which I appreciated. Walking back up to the cabin, he said, "You're going to want a better barrier than that eventually." "I know," I said. "This is the week 1 version." He almost smiled. "Fair enough." Inside the cabin, Tom had set up a station at the kitchen table with the shortwave radio and a notebook. He was logging every broadcast he could find, station, time, content, with the systematic thoroughness of a person who needed to do something with his hands and his brain. I looked over his shoulder at what he'd written. The Knoxville station was still on. There was a station from Asheville that had appeared that morning, a local one, a small AM station, reading what sounded like government instructions in a tired voice. Shelter in place. Boil water. Do not approach anyone displaying the following symptoms. The following symptoms were confusion, aggression, discolored eyes, reduced pain response, bites or lacerations on the skin that appeared self-inflicted. Self-inflicted. That one stuck with me. There was also a signal Tom had found on the shortwave that wasn't a regular broadcast station. It was a voice reading coordinates in a pattern that repeated every 40 minutes. Same voice, same cadence, same set of coordinates. Tom had written them down. They pointed to something in northern Tennessee, about 120 miles from our location as the crow flew. "Military?" I asked. "Or someone with a good transmitter and a plan," Tom said. I looked at the coordinates. I had a paper map of the region, my father's, taken from the shelf when I'd cleaned out his things, and I spread it on the table and found the approximate location. It was in the Cherokee National Forest, which I knew from my ranger years. Remote, high elevation, multiple access roads. If you wanted to establish something defensible and hidden in northern Tennessee, you could do worse. Russell, from across the room where he was helping Boyd and Dale sort through the food stores, said, "It could be bait." I looked at him. "Someone broadcasting fake coordinates to get people moving," he said. "Get them out in the open. Get them on roads where they're vulnerable." "Who would do that?" Tom said. Russell looked at Tom with the expression of a man who'd thought about human nature in darker rooms than Tom had occupied. "People who need what other people have," he said. I marked the coordinates on the map anyway. Then I folded the map and put it in my jacket pocket. That night we had a general accounting of what we had. This was my initiative. I put everyone at the kitchen table, which meant Lily sat in someone's lap, and I went through the supplies with everyone watching. I did it this way on purpose, not because I needed their help to inventory things, but because I needed them to understand what the situation was, and I needed to see how each person responded to honest numbers. Food. We had the stock I'd bought in Hatchet Creek on Wednesday, plus what I'd bought the previous Tuesday, plus what I'd found in my father's pantry, which was more than I'd expected. My father had been, according to his habit, quietly prepared in the way that men who live alone in mountains tend to be. He had dried beans in 5-gallon buckets with tight lids. He had rice, same. He had canned goods, tomatoes, corn, green beans, peaches, the off-brand kind in industrial quantities, lined up on the pantry shelf with the specificity of a man who'd decided that the kind of cans you bought said something about the kind of person you were. He had jerky in sealed bags. He had cooking oil and baking supplies and about 30 pounds of cornmeal. He had some things I didn't recognize immediately as food until I looked closer. Dried mushrooms, vacuum-sealed, and a jar of what turned out to be rendered bear fat, which my father had apparently both hunted successfully and then kept this fact from every member of his family. Tom and Brenda had brought food for maybe 4 days for 2 people. Russell had brought considerably more. The organized hunting pack, when I had a chance to look at it properly, contained a week of freeze-dried meals for 3 people, plus an impressive amount of ammunition, which was its own kind of resource. Dale had arrived with nothing. Total food estimate, combined and rationed, 5 to 6 weeks for 9 people, which sounds okay until you think about what happens in week 7. Water. The spring was working. That was our biggest advantage. In an emergency, water is the first thing you lose, either by running out or by it becoming unsafe. And we had a gravity-fed spring that I'd maintained myself and that I trusted. I set Tom the task of checking the intake daily and keeping the overflow clear. Fuel. The propane tank was at roughly 55% now, having lost 5 points to cooking and water heating since we'd arrived. At current usage, if we were careful, we had about 8 weeks of cooking fuel. Generator fuel was a different problem. Gasoline, not propane, and we'd gone through about a quarter of what we had in the single gas can in the generator shed by the second day, running the generator for 2 hours of power each evening. At that rate, we had maybe 3 weeks before the gas ran out. I needed to do a fuel run, and I needed to do it soon. Firearms. My father's shotgun, 2 boxes of 12-gauge shells, his .30-06 rifle, 1 box of shells. Russell had a hunting rifle and 308 caliber, a semi-automatic pistol that I didn't ask him about directly but that looked like a Glock, and more ammunition than I asked him to inventory out loud, because the number of shells a person carries tells you something about what they think is going to happen, and I didn't want that information loose in the room yet. Boyd had a pistol, a cheap one, the kind you bought at a gun show. I had a hunting knife, a multi-tool, and skills from 6 years in the National Forest that weren't a substitute for a firearm, but weren't nothing. Total group, 9 people. 2 children, one of whom was 13 and technically capable of following instructions, and one of whom was 8 and needed to not understand what was happening in too much detail. 2 older adults who were functional, but not physically at full capacity. Brenda with her knee, Dale who was maybe 50 and in okay shape, but not in the kind of shape the situation was going to require. 4 adults in reasonable condition. 1 adult with military or paramilitary adjacent skills and habits that I still hadn't identified the source of. I laid this out at the table without dramatizing it. Tom wrote it down. Donna sat across from me and listened. Russell listened. Dale stared at his coffee. "Questions?" I said. "How long do you think it lasts?" Tom asked. He meant the outbreak, the crisis, whatever we were calling it. "I don't know," I said. "Weeks? Months?" "I don't know, Tom." He wrote something in his notebook. I went to bed that night with a list in my head that was longer than the list I'd had when we arrived. And the list from when we arrived had included things like fix roof corner, and check spring intake, and remind Ethan about baseball practice next week. That last item felt like a memory from a different country. I lay in the dark next to Donna and listened to the forest. It was still quiet. Whatever was wrong with the birds, it was still wrong. The first run down the mountain happened on Saturday, 4 days in. I went alone. This was a deliberate decision and not a popular one. Russell wanted to come, which I understood, and Tom wanted to come, which I said no to, because I needed Tom at the cabin running the radio. I took the truck, the shotgun, a gas can, and the list I'd been building mentally for 2 days. The logging road was empty. The log barrier I'd put up Friday was undisturbed, which meant nobody had come up the road since then, which I took as good news. I moved the logs aside with the truck and then got out and moved them back by hand, because I didn't want to leave the road open while I was down below. The first mile of the county road was quiet. The second mile I saw the car. It was a Honda Civic, dark blue, on the right shoulder with 2 of its doors open. Nobody in it that I could see. I slowed down as I passed and looked in the windows. Groceries on the back seat, spilled, a box of cereal on the floor with the bag torn open. Somebody had stopped fast. Somebody had gotten out fast. No blood, no broken glass. I kept driving. Hatchet Creek was a mile further. I drove into the town proper, the 400 souls, the gas station, the hardware store, and I counted 4 vehicles I could see, 2 on the main street, and 1 in the hardware store parking lot, and 1 crossways at the intersection that might have been a vehicle accident, and might have just been someone who parked in a hurry. The gas station lights were off. The hardware store blinds were down. I didn't see any people, moving or otherwise. I drove to the gas station first. The pumps were the old kind, manual trigger, no pay-it pump. They ran off a pump house behind the station that I was betting ran off the town electric grid, which was probably not running. But I'd thought about this. In my Ranger years, I'd had to hand pump fuel from disabled station tanks twice during storm emergencies, and the process wasn't complicated. You needed a hand pump and a hose long enough to reach the underground tank, and the underground tank would still have fuel in it regardless of whether the electric pump above it worked. I had a hand pump. My father had one in the generator shed, the kind sold for agricultural use. Red plastic with a metal outlet and a 3-foot hose. I had 2 5-gallon gas cans and a 30-gallon auxiliary tank in the truck bed. I parked at the pump island, got out, and listened. The town was very quiet. Not the complete silence of the forest above. There was wind here, and 2 trash cans somewhere that were rolling against something, and a sign creaking on its hinges over the hardware store. But no human sounds, no generators, no dogs, no birds, nothing that moved with intent. I worked fast. Removed the lock from the underground tank access with a pry bar. It was a standard tumbler lock, and the pry bar was sufficient, and threaded the hand pump hose down into the tank. Began pumping. Gasoline came up in about 12 strokes. I filled both 5-gallon cans first, then ran the hose to the auxiliary tank in the truck bed. While the pump ran, I went inside the station. The door was unlocked. The overhead lights were off, but there was enough window light to see. The register was open and empty, which meant somebody had come in before me, or Britt had emptied it before she left. Probably the latter. The racks of food and supplies were mostly intact, not untouched. Some things were missing, things with obvious immediate value. The water bottles gone, the energy bars gone, the cigarettes conspicuously absent, which told me something about human priorities. But there was a lot left. I took a shopping basket and worked through the store. Canned goods from the small section. Soup, beans, chili, Spam. Batteries, AAA and D, a lot of them. More than I'd have thought to bring a basket for, so I took 2 trips. First aid supplies from behind the counter. I found a box of surgical gloves, a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, a roll of sterile gauze, vitamins, salt in the large container, Ziploc bags, a rag and a bottle of bleach from the cleaning supplies shelf, matches, 3 boxes, and a lighter, 4 of them. Rope, a coil of clothesline that was maybe 50 feet, a box of heavy-duty trash bags, a pocket knife from the display rack. I loaded everything in the truck cab, checked the pump hose in the auxiliary tank. Still going. I went to the hardware store next. Wendell's shop. The blinds were down, and the door was locked, but the lock was a standard keyed deadbolt, and the door had a glass pane. I used the handle of the pry bar wrapped in my jacket to break the corner pane, reached through, unlocked it from inside. The shop smelled of sawdust and metal and oil, the particular smell of hardware stores everywhere, and for a second I stood in the doorway and felt the strangeness of breaking into a place that had been ordinary 3 days ago. Then I made myself move. I didn't have time to be careful and selective, so I was efficient instead. Nails, all gauges, screws, 2 additional pry bars, wire, electrical wire, a spool of 12 gauge, rope, the good stuff, 3/8 inch braided nylon, cable ties, a bolt cutter, 2 padlocks, a handsaw, hinges, lag screws, a wood chisel, a bottle of liquid nails adhesive, a come-along, the heavy-duty kind, better than what I had. I found, in a back room that might have been Wendell's personal storage, a small gasoline-powered generator, a 3,500-watt Generac, older but solid. I put that in the truck too. I went back to the gas station and disconnected the hand pump. The auxiliary tank had about 25 gallons in it. I'd taken almost everything I'd come for, and I'd been in town for about 35 minutes, and I hadn't seen or heard anything human. Then I heard something at the end of the main street. It was a sound I hadn't heard before, and haven't quite found the right way to describe since. A kind of low ambient noise, almost like rain before it arrives. The sound of many small sounds happening simultaneously, at a distance that makes them blend into one. I stood between the truck and the pump island and listened to it for about 5 seconds before I understood what it was. It was footsteps, a lot of them, on the road outside of town, from the direction of the county road south, coming toward Hatchet Creek. I got in the truck. I pulled out of the gas station heading north, back toward the logging road, and I didn't look in my mirrors for the first 100 yards because I didn't want to know. Then I did look. There were people on the main street. A lot of them. 15, maybe 20 that I could see, more behind them. They were walking in the way I'd been told they walked, not running, not purposeful in any directed way, more like a crowd that had lost its event. Everyone walking in roughly the same direction because that's where the others were going. They were moving toward where I'd been. I drove north at the speed the road allowed and kept not looking in the mirrors. I got back to the logging barrier and moved the logs with my hands, fast, and drove through and got out and moved them back. My hands were shaking, but steady enough to handle the logs. I sat in the truck for about 2 minutes, with the engine off and the doors locked, and watched the road below the barrier. Nothing came up. I drove back to the cabin. Russell came out to the truck before I'd even killed the engine. He looked in the truck bed in the cab and then looked at me. "How many?" he said. "I saw maybe 20, I said. "On the main street. Could have been more. Armed? Not that I could see." He nodded slowly. "Good run." I got out and started unloading. The getting started was the thing. Once you were doing something, the shaking in your hands stopped being something you thought about. By the end of the first week, we had the cabin running on a system. That might sound like too strong a word for what we had, which was people doing things at roughly the same times each day out of necessity rather than design. But system is the right word, because systems are what separate surviving from just not dying yet. And in that first week we were finding the shape of how things were going to work. The water check was Tom's at 6 a.m. He'd go up the hill to the spring box with a flashlight and a small brush, and clear anything from the screen, and log the flow in his notebook, which he'd started using as a general record of everything. Dates, inventory changes, events, weather. I looked at it every evening. It was becoming the closest thing we had to a map of our situation. The food was Donna and Brenda, which Donna had organized without being asked, by virtue of the fact that she was the one who'd grown up canning and preserving with her grandmother, and actually understood how to make dried beans go further than the package implied. Brenda's clinic nursing background translated into something approaching a nutritional logic about what we needed in terms of calories and protein, and the combination of those two women managing the kitchen produced better outcomes than I would have gotten by myself. Ethan had taken on the firewood. This surprised me. He'd announced it at the general table meeting at the end of the first week, not in the way teenage boys usually announce things, which is either reluctantly or by overstating confidence to mask the opposite, but just matter-of-factly. He'd said, "I can do the firewood. I've been watching how you split it." He was right that he'd been watching. He was wrong that watching was sufficient to doing, which he discovered on the first morning. But by the third day he had the technique, and by the end of the week he was reliable, which was the thing I was proudest of, that I never said to him directly. Russell and Boyd handled what I was calling perimeter work, which was checking the fence line around the property, maintaining the road barrier, and doing the morning and evening observation from the tree line, which gave a partial view of the valley below. 2 people, 2-hour shifts, twice a day. They had binoculars, Russell's, good ones. Dale helped wherever he was useful, which was generally for anything physical and near the cabin, and which he did without complaint. I liked Dale Whitfield. He was not a complicated man, but he was a genuine one, and in the circumstances, genuine felt like a significant quality. Lily helped Brenda in the kitchen, which Lily had decided was her role, and which Brenda had agreed to with more grace than the job required. Lily was 8, and her help was mostly enthusiastic interference. But Brenda managed it without once suggesting that it was interference, which is a skill I appreciated. I did everything else, which was daily inventory review, maintenance of the generator and propane system, firearms cleaning and ammunition accounting, any structural work the cabin needed, and the ongoing problem of thinking about what came next. What came next was not a comfortable thing to think about, but the alternative was not thinking about it, which was comfortable in the short term and fatal in the longer one. At night, when the kids were asleep and Donna was reading by oil lamp, one of the old kerosene lamps my father had kept for power outages, I sat on the porch with the map and thought about the roads. My father had, in his 9 years on the mountain, accumulated a specific kind of knowledge about the area that wasn't in any published form, but that he'd begun to write down in a composition notebook he kept in the kitchen drawer. I'd found it the first day, thought it was a grocery list, set it aside, and come back to it now. It wasn't organized. He wrote the way he thought, which was in fragments and observations, and occasional fully formed paragraphs that seemed to come from nowhere. But there was information in it. The old logging roads he knew about. There were 3 that the county maps didn't show, 2 of which were seasonal access roads the timber company had cut in the 60s and never formally maintained, but that remained passable for a high-clearance vehicle. He'd noted the ranger station, a seasonal station that the Forest Service operated about 8 miles north along the ridge, unmanned since they'd cut the seasonal staffing, but which would still have supplies. I'd worked out of that ranger station 3 seasons. Before I'd left for Atlanta, I knew the storage shed. I knew what was in it. That was the next run I needed to make. But before the next run, something happened with Dale. It was the 9th day in the cabin. I woke at 3 in the morning to a sound from the loft, the particular creak of the loft ladder, which I'd already mapped unconsciously in the way you learn to map the sounds of a house after a few nights. I got up and went to the kitchen. Dale was at the kitchen table in the dark, sitting with both hands flat on the table and his head down. Not crying, just still, like a man who'd put himself somewhere very far away from the room he was physically in. I made coffee without turning on any light beyond the small oil lamp I carried from the bedroom. Set a cup in front of him. He didn't look up. I sat down. "My daughter," he said finally. "She lives in Gainesville, Georgia. I haven't talked to her since Tuesday." I didn't say anything. "She's got a little kid, my grandson. He's 4. He looked up. In the lamplight, his face had that carved-down quality that fear and no sleep produces in older men. I don't know how to not know if they're okay. "I know," I said. "Do you? I mean..." He stopped, tried again. "I keep thinking about what Terry looked like. My neighbor, the one who came to my door. And then I think about Gainesville, about a city that size." "There's nothing you can do about Gainesville right now," I said. "I know that," he said, like knowing it wasn't the point. I sat with him for a while, didn't try to fix the thing I couldn't fix. Eventually he drank the coffee and we talked about things that didn't matter. His farm, the breed of cattle he'd been running, the problem he'd been having with a fence line before all this started, and the talking was a different kind of not fixing, the kind that helps by being about nothing. At about 4 he said, "That arm Terry grabbed. I'm watching it." "I know you are," I said. "It doesn't look like anything." "It doesn't. But I keep thinking, what if..." "Dale," I said, "if something were going to happen from contact like that, it would have happened in the first 48 hours. That's what the broadcasts were saying before the Knoxville station went quiet. You're 9 days out." He nodded, slowly. "Okay." He went back to the loft. I sat at the table for a while with the oil lamp, looked at my father's composition notebook. On the 3rd page, between a note about the spring intake and a note about the direction the county road flooded when it rained hard, he'd written something that I'd read a few times already. "The thing about this mountain is that it forgets you're there. That's either good or bad depending on what you want it to forget." I hadn't known what he meant when I'd first read it. I was beginning to. The ranger station run was on day 11, and I want to tell you about it in some detail, because it was the day things changed shape again. I took the logging road north. Not the county road, the secondary track my father had noted. The old timber company access road that ran along the ridge for about 6 miles before connecting to a fire road that passed within half a mile of the ranger station. I'd scouted the first mile of it 2 days earlier, and it was rough but passable for the truck. Russell came this time. I'd asked him because I needed someone who could handle a firearm if it came to that, and because I'd decided I needed to know more about Russell Greer, and the way you learn things about people in these situations is by putting them in situations where they have to decide things. He rode in the passenger seat with his .308 across his knees. We'd left at first light, 6:15, and the mountain air at that hour was cold enough to show breath. We didn't talk much in the first few miles. The track required attention. Roots crossing the road, branches low enough to drag on the roof. One section where a small wash had cut across the road, and I had to pick a line carefully. I noticed that Russell tracked the tree line without being obvious about it. The sweep of eyes that happens below conscious thought when someone's trained to watch perimeters. "Military?" I said, at a point where the road opened up and I had a hand free. He looked at me. "Marines." 12 years. When? Came out in 2008. Did 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. You? Park Service. No military. He nodded. "But you know this mountain." "I worked the ranger district that includes this ridge for 3 years. "That's why you knew about the access roads." "That's why." We drove another mile. Then he said, "Can I ask why you left?" "The Rangers." "Atlanta happened," I said, which was the answer I usually gave. It was true, and it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I'd been good at being a ranger and increasingly bad at being a husband at the same distance. And Donna had said something to me during our 3rd year in the mountains that I'd heard clearly enough to understand that I had to choose. And I'd chosen, and I still didn't know if the choice was right, only that the alternative was not making a choice and watching what I had go away by not deciding. Russell seemed to understand there was an answer inside the answer, and didn't push it. The ranger station appeared through the trees at about 7:30. It was a small structure, a main building that was part equipment storage, part seasonal office, part emergency shelter, built in the late 80s, and maintained in the basic utilitarian way of Forest Service buildings, which is to say, it was not beautiful, but it was solid. A separate storage shed 20 feet behind it. A covered wood rack that I could see from the approach still had wood in it. A flagpole without a flag. I pulled up and stopped, and we both sat in the truck for a full minute, windows down, listening. Nothing. We got out. The main building was locked with a standard Forest Service padlock, which I had the combination to from my ranger days. These things never changed. It was a culture of institutional inertia, and when I entered the numbers, the lock opened. Inside, a desk, 2 chairs, a first aid cabinet on the wall, a storage locker in the corner, a shelf of reference materials. It smelled of old paper and rodent. Nobody had been in here recently. I went to the storage locker. Open. Inside, emergency supplies, the standard Forest Service cache. First aid kits, 4 of them, the professional grade kind, with wound packing and SAM splints, not the consumer camping kind. Water purification tablets, bulk, MREs, 24 of them, military surplus ones, the good ones. 2 handheld radios, Forest Service band, with charging packs, a hatchet, a signal mirror, road flares. I took all of it. In the storage shed, gasoline, 2 5-gallon cans, still good, a chainsaw with a half-full bar oil container, a come-along, another one, extension cords, 4 of them, a work light, 2 sets of rain gear, tools, a pipe wrench, a bolt-action staple gun, a hand drill, bits, a box of mixed hardware, bolts, nuts, washers, a length of galvanized pipe, cable clamps. I took all of that too. Russell was loading things into the truck bed with methodical efficiency and not commenting on any of it, which was the right approach. I came back inside for a second sweep and found something I'd missed the first time. In the desk drawer, under a Forest Service regulation handbook and 2 expired permits, there was a logbook. The kind used for trail conditions and wildlife sightings, a standard green-covered composition notebook, similar to my father's, maintained in a neat hand by whoever did the seasonal recording here. The last entry was from August. Nothing unusual. Trail conditions. A black bear sighting on the North Ridge. A note about a damaged footbridge at a creek crossing 3 miles up. The entry before that was from late July, and the entry before that was a different hand entirely, and it was dated September 4th. I stopped. September 4th was yesterday. The entry was short. It was written fast. The handwriting different from the seasonal ranger's neat notes. This was someone using a pen in a hurry, pressing too hard. It said, Came up from Hatchet Creek. Don't know if anyone will see this. Things in the valley are bad, very bad. I won't write out the details. I am going further north along the Ridge Road, and then down the backside toward the National Forest boundary. If anyone from the service finds this, the outbreak started earlier than they're saying. I know because I saw it. I was in Gainesville, Georgia on September 1st, and I saw what they're calling Patient Zero materials at the CDC field office there, and I am telling you that the infection was in the population at least 72 hours before the first public reports. Somebody made a decision to delay the information. I don't know why, I don't know who, but somebody knew and chose not to tell people. GRT. I read it 3 times. Russell came to the door. I handed him the logbook without saying anything. Watched him read it. He read it once, which was enough for him. GRT, he said. Could be anyone, I said. Could be. Could also be. Yeah, he said. The infection had been in the population 3 days before anyone said anything publicly, which meant that the first wave we'd seen in Hatchet Creek, the groups on the roads, the behavior reports from Charlotte and Columbia, those weren't the beginning. They were several generations of spread past the beginning, whatever that beginning was. I took the logbook. We drove back in about the same silence we'd driven up in, except it was a different kind of silence, the kind that happens after information rearranges things. At one point on the road back, coming around a curve, we came across something in the track. It was a person, a man, judging by the build and the clothing, work pants, a canvas jacket, heavy boots. He was standing in the middle of the road about 30 yards ahead of us and facing away, just standing. The truck stopped, and he didn't react. He didn't turn around. I kept the engine running. We watched him for about 90 seconds. He didn't move. He wasn't doing anything. Standing in the middle of an old logging road in the mountains, facing away from us, not moving. Russell said, very quietly, "Back up." "He might be." "He's not hurt," Russell said. "Look at how he's standing. Hurt people don't stand like that." He was right. The posture was wrong for injury. No compensating tilt, no favored side. He was just standing, like he was waiting for something to tell him to do the next thing. I put the truck in reverse and backed slowly around the curve, out of his sight line. Then I found a place to turn around, narrow, took 3-point, Russell watching out his window the whole time, and I drove back the long way, which added 40 minutes, but didn't involve driving past the man in the road. When we got back to the cabin, I didn't tell everyone about the logbook entry right away. I told Donna that night, in the bedroom, with the door closed. She listened to the whole thing sitting on the edge of the bed. Then she said, "So it was already everywhere when they told us to shelter in place." Probably. So sheltering in place was already damage control, I said. Not prevention. Yeah. She sat with that. "Does it change anything?" she said. "Not what we do," I said. "It might change how long we plan for." She nodded slowly. "Okay." That was Donna's way, and I say that with all the love I have for her, which is the full amount. She took the shape of things as they were, and found the next question. She didn't spiral. She didn't perform acceptance. She actually arrived at it, faster than I did, most of the time. "How long do we plan for?" she said. "I don't know," I said, "but longer than 6 weeks." The 3rd week brought the first real close call. It happened at the road barrier, which we'd by now improved considerably. The 2 logs were still the core of it, but Russell and Boyd had spent 3 days adding to it. A second layer of logs behind the first, then a section of fence rail from the old fence line we'd dismantled from the east side of the property, creating something that was now about 4 feet high and essentially impassable to anything that moved on 2 legs without thinking about it first. We'd also strung a wire at ankle height about 20 yards down the road from the barrier, attached to 3 tin cans with pebbles in them, which was a low-tech but effective early warning for anything approaching in the dark. The cans went off at just after 2 in the morning on a Thursday. I heard them from the bedroom, the small irregular rattle, 3 or 4 seconds of it, then stopping, I was up and had the shotgun before I was fully conscious of deciding to do those things. Donna, who'd been awake anyway, said nothing. I went to the main room. Russell was already there, dressed, pistol in hand. He'd slept light for as long as I'd known him. We looked at each other and didn't say anything and went out the back door, around the cabin, through the trees parallel to the road rather than on it. There were 2 of them at the barrier, both men. One was against the fence section, both hands on the top rail, pushing in a slow, experimental way, not trying to climb it, just pushing against it like checking whether it was solid. The other was standing about 5 feet back, looking at the first one, or looking at the barrier, hard to tell in the dark. I had a flashlight but didn't use it. The moonlight was enough that I could see they weren't behaving like people who were trying to get somewhere. They were doing the thing the standing man on the logging road had been doing, that quality of purposeless occupation, being in a place because they'd arrived at it, rather than because they'd chosen it. Russell was to my left, about 8 feet away, in the trees. He had his pistol up. I had mine. The shotgun was back in the cabin. I'd come out with the pistol from my father's collection that I hadn't told anyone about yet, a .357 revolver I'd found in the closet, and cleaned and loaded my second week here. We watched the 2 figures. They didn't approach the tree line. They didn't seem to have any awareness that we were there, which should have been reassuring, except for what it meant about their overall state, which was not reassuring. The one pushing against the barrier stopped pushing, stood for a moment, then turned and walked back down the road, disappearing into the darkness below. The second one followed without any apparent communication between them. We waited 10 minutes. Then we went back to the cabin. In the main room, in the dark, Russell said, "They smelled us." What? The way they both faced toward the tree line when they stopped. They didn't see us, but they paused facing us. I think they were smelling. That's not, I started, and then stopped, because I wasn't sure what I was going to say. Not something they should be able to do? Except we didn't actually know what they should or shouldn't be able to do. We knew almost nothing about what we were dealing with except what we'd observed, which was the standing man on the road, and now these 2, and the pattern in those observations suggested something about sensory capability that I didn't want to say out loud yet. "In the morning," I said, "I want to add another tripwire." "Further out." Russell nodded. "I'll do it," he said, and went back to his sleeping spot on the main room floor with the ease of someone accustomed to sleeping in difficult places. I sat at the kitchen table for a while with the .357 in my hand, not pointing at anything. The composition notebook was on the table. I opened it to my father's handwriting. I read the same page several times without reading it. At 4 a.m. I went back to bed. The end of the 3rd week brought rain, and with the rain, a problem with the roof. Not the corner I'd patched, which held fine. I'd done that job well, and I was allowing myself the small satisfaction of knowing it. A different section, over the loft, where a seam in the original steel roofing had separated enough that water found its way in. Not a catastrophic leak, but a steady drip that hit the loft floor directly above where Dale slept. Dale discovered it by waking up with wet hair, which he mentioned at breakfast in the flat, factual tone he'd adopted for the processing of unfortunate information. I went up on the roof in the rain, which was not how I'd have chosen to spend that morning, and worked for 2 hours with roofing sealant and a strip of self-adhesive flashing I'd taken from the hardware store. The rain made it miserable, and the sealant doesn't like wet surfaces, but the flashing adhesive held, and I bedded it down with enough pressure that I thought it would last through the fall. While I was up there, lying flat on the wet steel, pressing the flashing down, I was watching the valley. From the roof, you could see a considerable distance south, through gaps in the tree canopy. The valley floor, the lower mountain slopes, the faint geometry of Hatchet Creek's buildings about 3 miles down, and movement. I'd been watching movement in the valley most of my time up on the roof, whenever weather and light permitted. There was always movement down there now, not random movement. That was the thing that kept bothering me, that I kept cataloging without enough data to make sense of. The figures in the valley, what I could see of them from 3 miles away through binoculars, didn't mill around randomly the way a crowd would. They moved in the same general direction, or they clustered in one spot for hours, or they spread out in patterns that, from elevation, looked almost deliberate. I said almost. I'm not saying it was. But the standing man on the road had known which direction we were in when he couldn't see us. And the two at the barrier had paused, facing the tree line where we stood. And the ones in the valley moved in patterns. I didn't talk about this with everyone, because I didn't have anything solid to say. I talked about it with Donna, who listened and said, "You're not imagining it." How do you know? Because you're not the kind of person who imagines things. That was true, or at least it had been true once. Living in isolation with 9 people and insufficient information has a way of loosening the hinges on what you're sure about. Month 2 started with a problem nobody had thought to think about, which is the problem with things nobody thinks to think about. Ethan started limping. Not badly. I noticed it on a morning when he carried firewood from the lean-to, and I could see from the porch that his right foot wasn't landing right. I called him over after he'd stacked the wood and asked him to take his boot off. The sole of his foot was in bad shape, not infected. We'd caught it early enough, but blistered to the point of broken skin, on the heel and the ball, from wearing boots that were a size too small. He'd grown half a size in the summer, and neither of us had noticed because he'd been in sneakers all summer, and the boots were his hiking boots from a camping trip a year ago, and they hadn't fit right since July, and he hadn't said anything. When I asked him why he hadn't said anything, he looked at me with a 13-year-old's patience for adult questions and said, "Because what were you going to do about it?" Which was the right question, and also a fair indictment. Brenda treated the blisters. She was good at this, clinical and quick, and with an economy of supplies that came from years of knowing that supplies ran out and had to last. She wrapped his foot in gauze and told him to air it out as much as possible and to tell her if it got warm or smelled wrong. The boot problem wasn't solvable from the cabin. We had what we had. Ethan took to wearing 2 pairs of socks stuffed into the boot to fill the gap, which worked well enough. But it was a reminder. Clothes wore out. Shoes wore out. Our bodies kept doing the biological thing of growing and aging, regardless of whether the world outside was cooperating with that process. We had what we'd packed for a family move, not for a winter siege. We needed more. This was what started the conversation about the Ellijay run. Ellijay was the nearest actual town. Proper grocery store, hardware store, pharmacy, clothing stores. 30 miles from the cabin by the road we'd normally take, more by the back way. But Ellijay was also at a lower elevation, and from everything we'd observed over the past month, lower elevation meant more infected, more danger, more of the groups we kept seeing moving through the valley. I'd been thinking about Ellijay for 2 weeks. I'd been not thinking about it the way you don't think about a thing when you're working up to committing to it. I laid it out at the table one evening in the beginning of October, with the leaves on the north ridge fully changed now, the hemlocks holding their dark green, the days shortening fast. "We need a supply run into Ellijay," I said. "Specifically, clothing and footwear, medical supplies, as much non-perishable food as we can carry, and anything useful from the hardware or farm supply stores." Nobody said no, which told me they'd all been thinking about it too. "When?" Tom said. "Day after tomorrow. Early. I want to be in and out before noon." "Who's going?" Russell said. "Me," I said. "And Brenda, because she knows what medical supplies are worth getting." I'd thought about this. I didn't want Russell's first instinct in a supply run, which would be to acquire anything that could be used offensively. I wanted the medical intelligence that Brenda would bring. Russell didn't object to being left behind, but he looked at me carefully for a second. "I'll keep the barrier." "I know you will." The evening before the Ellijay run, Dale found me at the porch. "Nate," he said, "I need to tell you something." I waited. "When I came up here," he said, "from my farm, when Terry grabbed me." "Yeah." He didn't just grab my arm. I looked at him. He got my jacket too, the left shoulder. I pulled away, and he had my jacket in his teeth for a second. Just a second. I pulled hard, and the fabric tore. I kept looking at him. I didn't have anything under the jacket on that shoulder. But I don't know. I don't know if the skin contact. Did anything break the skin? I don't know, he said. I checked that night and I didn't see anything. But I don't know if that means nothing happened. He was standing with his hands in his pockets and looking at me with the face of a man who'd been carrying this for 3 weeks. I should have told you, he said. Yeah, I said. You should have. I was scared you'd put me out. I thought about that. I looked at him, at Dale Whitfield, who'd helped split firewood, and who'd sat with Lily for an hour one afternoon when she was having a bad day, and helped her build something out of sticks and string that she called a house, and he called an engineering accomplishment. I thought about what I knew about transmission, which was not enough, and what I'd observed about Dale over 3 weeks, which was that he was fine. He was healthy. He was tired and scared and guilty, but he was fine. You're 3 weeks out, I said. I know. Everything we've seen suggests it moves faster than that. I know. I looked at the mountain above us, the stars again, the same excessive sky. I'm going to tell Donna, I said. She needs to know, because she's managing the medical situation. Okay, he said. You should have told me 3 weeks ago, Dale. I know, he said. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Don't hide things. We're all we've got up here. He nodded. Didn't say anything else. Went back inside. I stood on the porch for a long time. Thought about the 3-week window. Thought about whether I was being accurate or wishful. Thought about the fact that I had no way to know the difference. Then I went inside and told Donna. Ella J, on a Thursday morning in October. I need to tell you what it looked like from the truck window, because it's important, I think, to have a picture of what was actually happening to a small American town a month after the start of something like this. Because the word fallen gets used about places, and it implies a dramatic collapse, walls down, smoke rising, the visible architecture of disaster. Ella J in October didn't look like that exactly. It looked mostly like a town where everybody had left in a hurry, and then a smaller number of people had come back, who were not the original people. The main street had cars parked on it in the normal places, but the pattern was wrong. Cars stopped where people had gotten out of them quickly, not where people had chosen to park. There was a pickup truck in the middle of the intersection at Highway 52 and Main Street, with both front doors open and the engine compartment open, like someone had been looking at the engine when they'd been interrupted. The grocery store, which was a Food Lion, had its front window broken, the kind of break you get from human impact at speed, not from deliberate smashing, and the automatic door was jammed open. Brenda and I sat in the truck for 3 minutes at the edge of the main street and watched. I could see 3 of them from where we sat. One on the sidewalk in front of what used to be a real estate office, one at the far end of the street, in the intersection, doing the standing still thing. One more that I couldn't quite see clearly, in the shadows of an alley between buildings. They weren't congregating. That was an observation I kept coming back to. The ones we saw individually or in small groups didn't seem to be grouping up. In the valley, we'd seen large groups. But those groups seemed to be mobile aggregates that formed around certain conditions. Sound, primarily, or maybe mass, the gravitational social pull of more of them in one place drawing others. And when the conditions changed, the groups dissolved. Here there were 3, spread out, not moving toward each other. We go to the pharmacy first, I said, then the hardware store, then the grocery if we have time. The grocery first, Brenda said. More people went to the pharmacy. More infected around it, probably. She was right. I pulled around the back street, came at the grocery from the rear. Service entrance, the loading dock. The rolling metal door was up and the dock was empty and dark. We got out and listened for 30 seconds, and then went in. The back of a grocery store in a month of abandonment had a smell that I'll describe as the smell of things that have gone from food to not food. The produce section was a landscape of black and gray, things that had been fruit and vegetables following their natural progression without refrigeration, and we went past it fast with our mouths covered. The dairy case was worse. We didn't go near the dairy case. The center aisles were mostly intact. A month of people grabbing things in crisis had cleaned out the obvious stuff. Nothing on the canned soup shelf, nothing on the peanut butter shelf, nothing in the pasta aisle except one box of rigatoni with a dent in it that someone had left, because the dented box is always the last one left. But there were things that people hadn't thought to take in a crisis. Cornmeal, multiple bags. Salt in bulk containers, 3 of them. Baking powder. Cooking oil, multiple bottles. A shelf of specialty items that nobody had wanted under normal circumstances, and nobody had grabbed in the crisis either. Dried lentils, dried chickpeas, various beans in bulk bags, nutrition the way your grandmother's grandmother would have recognized it. Long grain rice in the 5-pound bags, a dozen of them. Vitamins, the whole section of them. Prenatal vitamins, which Donna might need, which I thought of for the first time in that aisle for reasons I kept to myself. Baby food, a whole section of it, which we didn't need, but which Brenda swept into a cart anyway. For later, she said, and I didn't ask what she meant by later. Pet food, bulk bags. We didn't have a pet, but protein is protein, and dried kibble lasts a long time. We worked the store for about 25 minutes. I had 2 carts loaded and was calculating whether we could make another pass, when Brenda appeared from the next aisle with her hand up. She'd heard something. I stopped rolling the cart, listened. Footsteps. Inside the store, from the front section, coming toward the center aisles. Not the same irregular walking without purpose sound. This was a person with somewhere to go, moving at pace. I pulled Brenda into the canned goods aisle, and we went flat against the shelf. The footsteps came closer, reached the end of the aisle we'd just left, stopped. A man's voice, not loud, said, "Anyone there?" I stayed still. Brenda looked at me. I made a be still gesture. The man came around the end of the shelving unit and stopped about 10 feet from us. He was carrying a machete and wearing a green rain jacket. About 40, with several weeks of beard. He was breathing hard, which might have been exertion or might have been something else, but his eyes were tracking and clear. We looked at each other. "You're living somewhere," he said. Not a question. "Yeah," I said. "Local?" "No," I said. And then, because I'd learned Dale's lesson, not telling you where. He looked at the carts, looked at us, made a visible decision to not be aggressive about the information I'd just withheld. "There's more coming," he said. "From the south end. Big group, maybe 30. I've been watching them since morning." "How long?" I said. 10, 15 minutes before they reached this block." We took the carts. The man in the green jacket helped us push them without being asked. All 3 of us had a jog through the store's back section to the loading dock. I boosted the cart over the dock edge and he caught the other end, and we muscled the cases into the truck bed. Brenda did the lighter bags. 15 minutes. 10 times faster than the going in had been. When we were loaded, I looked at him. "You want to come?" I said, and immediately regretted it. "Where?" "Up the mountain." He looked north, like he was calculating something. Then, "No, I've got people. Closer in. But, thank you." He disappeared back into the store. I didn't ask his name, and he didn't ask mine. We drove out the back way and took the county road north before the 30 figures from the south end of Elijah arrived at the grocery store. On the way home, Brenda said, "You almost offered him directions." "Almost. You didn't." "No." She was quiet for a mile. "He might have needed directions. He might have needed what we have." She nodded. That was the thing about Brenda. She pushed back when she thought you were wrong, but she didn't argue once you'd given her the real answer. She just took it and factored it in, and didn't bring it up again. I drove home with a truck full of food, and a specific feeling I'd had before in my Ranger years. The feeling of having made it through something that required luck as much as skill, and of not knowing how much luck I had left. By the time winter arrived in the mountains, which happened faster and harder than I remembered even from my Ranger years, we had changed the cabin into something that wasn't the cabin anymore. The porch had a second roof, a lean-to addition that extended it on the north and east sides, built from timber we'd taken from the fallen oaks down the road, which gave us a covered outdoor workspace and a place to store a significant amount of firewood under cover, instead of letting it get wet. The generator had been moved into a small enclosed space under the new porch extension, which both protected it from weather and reduced the noise it produced, which I'd worried about since the first week. The windows had been fortified, not boarded, because boarding cuts your visibility and your light, but each window now had a set of internal shutters that could be dropped and secured from inside, made from the lumber we had and the hardware from Wendell's store. Closed up, the cabin was dark during the day, but solid. The road barrier was now something I was genuinely proud of. 3 weeks of intermittent work by Russell, Boyd, Dale, and Ethan had transformed it from 2 logs into a proper obstacle, a V-shaped fortification made of timber and wire and multiple tripwire systems, designed so that approaching from below, the path narrowed and slowed, and from above, it could be pulled closed in about 2 minutes from either end. I'd drawn the plans myself, based on what I remembered from a forestry training on trail corridor management and what Russell knew from his military experience about checkpoint design. It was the strangest collaboration. Inside the cabin, the storage situation had been reorganized 3 times as we brought in more supplies, developed better rationing systems, and figured out what we actually used versus what we thought we'd need. The dried beans and rice were now in a proper cold storage setup, my father's root cellar. I should tell you about the root cellar, because that deserves its own telling. I found it in late October, which means I'd been living in my father's cabin for 7 weeks before I found a significant feature of my father's cabin, which tells you something about my thoroughness and/or my father's secrecy. It was under the kitchen floor. There was a trapdoor, which I'd thought was a crawl space access because my father had put a braided rug over it and 2 chairs on the rug, and I'd never actually lifted the rug in 7 weeks, because why would you? Lily found it. She'd been doing something on the kitchen floor, involving her stick and string construction projects, and she'd pulled the rug aside to get more space, and the trapdoor had a pull ring set into a groove, and she pulled it because she was 8, and pull rings are irresistible. She called me in with the specific tone of voice that meant either she'd found something wonderful or she'd hurt herself, and it turned out to be the first thing. The root cellar was about 8 feet square and 6 feet deep, reached by a fixed wooden ladder. It had a hard-packed dirt floor, fieldstone walls, a very low constant temperature, I'd estimate 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and enough shelf space to store a significant quantity of food. My father had used it. There were jars there, home-canned vegetables and meat, and something I eventually identified as pickled mushrooms, sealed in beeswax over the lid. The kind of canning that's been done for 100 years before rubber gaskets. The jars were dated in his handwriting, 2023, 2024, 2025, his last summer's work. I sat on the bottom rung of the ladder and looked at the shelves. My father had known something, maybe not this specifically, but the preparation, the root cellar, the dried goods, the propane reserve, the second water intake he'd built parallel to the first, as a redundancy that I'd found and connected to in November, when the primary line developed a slow leak. He'd made these things deliberately, not as doomsday preparation in the obvious sense, but as the quiet, methodical work of a man who'd decided that self-sufficiency was worth the work, for reasons that might have been philosophical, or might have been something he'd seen coming in some general way that was more accurate than specific. I thought about his epitaph as given by Wendell. When he came in, he bought the right stuff. I sat in the root cellar and thought about my father for a long time, and I thought about Donna, because some of the jars were labeled in categories that weren't things my father would have eaten alone. Pickled beets, which he'd hated, which I knew for a fact. He'd labeled them as if someone else might want them. He'd made them for a version of the future that included someone else. Or maybe he'd made them for the version of the future that was now, that he'd somehow sensed was coming, that he'd put his quiet work against. I went back upstairs and told Donna about the root cellar. She went down and looked at the jars and didn't say anything for a minute. Then she said, "We should can everything we can before it's too cold." And we did. The first snow came the first week of November. It came fast, the way mountain snow does. Not the slow gray sky build of a storm developing, but an overnight shift that you noticed first by the silence, which was a different silence from the bird silence of the first days, this one being the padded cotton wool quiet of snow absorbing everything. I went out at 6 in the morning, and there were 8 inches on the ground, and more coming. The infections. I'd started calling them that, internally, not because I thought it was the right word, but because I needed a word that wasn't the other word, had been moving up the mountain, slowly, over the previous weeks. I'd seen them on the logging road twice, not approaching the barrier, just passing through on the road below, the groups drifting north, and up the way water sometimes runs uphill through capillary action, looking for reasons that weren't immediately apparent. The snow slowed them. More than that, the cold seemed to affect them. I'd been observing this without being confident enough to say it, but by the first week of heavy snow it was undeniable. The figures in the valley moved less. The ones I could see from the roof through the binoculars in the clear patches between storms were slower, more stationary, clustering in covered areas rather than wandering. Whatever drove the movement was being reduced by temperature. I told this to Russell on a morning when we were both at the porch watching the ridge. He said he'd noticed too. Cold-blooded isn't quite right, he said. They're not snakes. But there's something metabolic. The cold slows them down. Does it stop them? I don't think so. Just slows them. That gives us a window, I said. A winter window. He understood what I meant. Winter, if they were slower, was when we could do things we couldn't do at other times. Move further, explore further, secure things we'd only thought about securing. The first winter run was to the old mining claim. I'd found a reference to it in my father's notebook, written in that fragment style of his. Old ore assay shack at the head of the east drainage, built by the Harkins family in 1920s, abandoned since at least 1960s. Somebody stored equipment there in the 80s. There was a sketch map, my father's, done in pencil, the sort of map a man makes for himself that would be incomprehensible to anyone who didn't know the terrain, but I knew the terrain. The shack was 3 miles east along a ridgeline trail. In summer, 3 miles of mountain trail was an hour's work. In a foot of snow, with no trail visible, it was closer to 3. I went alone. This was my decision, and I didn't take suggestions about it. I went with the .357, the shotgun on my back, a pack with food and tools and the 2-way radio from the ranger station, and I went on snowshoes that my father had kept in the generator shed, old-fashioned wood and rawhide ones, the kind that actually work better in fresh unpacked snow than modern ones. The forest in snow. I'd forgotten this too. The particular quality of silence that's generated when every surface that normally reflects sound is buried under absorption, so that your own footsteps are the loudest thing by a factor of 10. The way animal tracks appear in snow and make the forest's invisible life suddenly legible. Here was a deer, here was a fox, here was something smaller, a weasel or a mink. Here was where the deer had stopped and stood, and here was the slight disturbed area where it had lain for a while. No human tracks except mine. The mining shack was where my father's map said it was, which was a small relief. I'd been doing navigation by landmark and compass, no GPS, no trail, and the places your brain second-guesses itself in blank white terrain are exactly the places you need to trust your work. The shack was solid stone below and old timber above, partially collapsed on the east side, where a tree had come down on it at some point in the last decade, but the main section was intact. The door was held by a padlock and chain that had rusted to decoration. One strike with the pry bar, and the whole assembly fell. Inside, exactly what my father had hinted. Equipment stored. Old equipment, the 1980s vintage he'd referenced, but equipment nonetheless. An old chainsaw, the kind from before everything was electronic, a McCulloch with a long bar. The bar probably past its useful life, but the saw engine possibly serviceable. More gas cans, metal, empty but sealable. A set of block and tackle rigging, good quality, the kind used for moving heavy things. A coil of electrical wire, older, with cloth insulation. Assorted hand tools in a metal box. These were in good shape, real quality tools. A man who'd actually used them had owned them. In a wooden crate in the corner, under a canvas tarp that had been weighed down with stones, ammunition, a lot of it. The kind of quantities that a hunter lays in when he expects to use it over many years, and buys bulk when the prices are right. 12-gauge shotgun shells, 2 cases, 30-06, which fit my father's rifle. A box of .357 Magnum that might have been stocked by the same person who'd originally owned my father's .357. Miscellaneous other calibers I didn't have guns for, but calibers that Tom or Russell might, and which could be traded if the idea of trading with other survivors became a real thing. I went back to the cabin carrying what I could on the first trip, told Russell about the rest. We went back together the following day with the sled, a plastic toboggan I'd found in the generator shed, the kind bought for children that turns out to be useful for hauling things in snow, and brought back everything worth bringing. The ammunition changed the supply calculations significantly. What had been a careful rationing of shells became something more comfortable without being unlimited, which felt important in December in a mountain cabin. December was when Tom started doing something strange. I noticed it first as an absence. He stopped maintaining his radio log with the regularity he'd started it with. He still sat at the kitchen table with the shortwave, but he wasn't writing things down anymore. He was listening differently. When I'd come in and check the log, he'd say something evasive about the signals being weak or the content being repetitive, and I'd accepted this for about 2 weeks before I looked at the log myself one morning when Tom was outside helping Ethan with the firewood. The log entries from the last 3 weeks were sparse, but on a separate sheet of paper, folded and tucked into the back of the notebook, there was something Tom had written down that he hadn't told me about. The shortwave signal from northern Tennessee, the one with the repeating coordinates, the one we'd heard in week 1, and I'd marked on the map. Tom had been tracking it for 2 months, and in the last 3 weeks, the signal had changed. It was no longer just coordinates. There were messages embedded in it, voice messages, short ones, transmitted in a way that required you to know what to listen for. Tom had found the pattern. The messages said, survivors at the location, 40-plus people, medical, food, semi-permanent structure. They were asking for others to come. Tom had been listening to this for 3 weeks without telling me. I took the sheet of paper and went to find him. He was coming in from the woodpile, carrying 2 logs, and he saw my face and stopped. "How long?" I said. He set the logs down. 3 weeks, maybe a little more. "Tom, I know." "You know what? I know I should have told you. He stopped, ran his hand through his hair, which had gotten long and unkempt in the way of all of us after 4 months without a haircut. "I knew what you'd say. You'd say we don't know if it's real. You'd say it could be bait, the same thing Russell said in week 1. And you'd be right, and then we'd move on and keep doing what we're doing. And He stopped again. "Tom," I said, "what is it you actually want to say?" He looked at me. In December's light, with the snow behind him and the cabin behind me, he looked tired in a very specific way. Not physically tired, but the tired of a man who'd been looking at the same walls for 4 months, and who'd started to measure the distance to something better. "Brenda's knee is getting worse," he said. "She hasn't said that to you. She doesn't complain. But I can see it. Cold affects it, I think. And she needs physical therapy, at minimum, or surgery at the outside, and we have neither of those things." I waited. "If the signal is real," he said, "if there are 40 people in a structure in the National Forest with medical supplies, Brenda could. There might be someone there who could." He stopped. I looked at the sheet of paper, at the coordinates, at the dates of the transmissions Tom had logged, careful and systematic even in the act of keeping them from me. 40 people, I said. "That's what they say. 100 miles. Roughly. In winter." "I know," he said. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at my father's map. Looked at the coordinates on Tom's sheet and found them as close as I could without surveying equipment. A valley in the Cherokee National Forest, accessible in summer by one of the main forest roads, accessible in winter only by a route that would need careful planning and good equipment and a lot of luck. I thought about Brenda's knee. I thought about 9 people in a 2-bedroom cabin with a supply window that, even with everything we'd done, had a horizon to it. I thought about the winter slowing the infected in the valley, giving us a window we didn't know how long we had. I thought about Russell, who I'd never quite stopped thinking about sideways. I went to the porch and called Donna out. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said, "Do you think it's real?" "I don't know." "What's your gut say?" "My gut says half of the people who respond to that signal are going to be people who genuinely need help," I said. "And my gut says the other half are going to be people who thought they were going somewhere safe and found something else when they got there." "Which half are we?" "I don't know that either." She looked at the mountain above us for a while. The snow was deep on the ridge, and the sky was the flat white of a sky that might produce more snow by evening. "Brenda's knee," she said. "Yeah, I've been watching it too," she said. "She's limping bad in the mornings. She soaks it at night. She doesn't say anything. Tom says it might need surgery. Tom's not a surgeon, but he's not wrong." We stood on the porch in the cold. "Can we get there?" she said. "In winter? If the forest roads are clear enough for the truck, and if we can find fuel along the way, and if the signal is real." "And that," I said. She looked at me. What would Walt have done? I thought about my father's notebook, about the root cellar and the pickled beets and the second water intake, about the composition notebook that said the mountain forgets you're there. "He wouldn't have gone," I said. "My dad would have stayed on the mountain and trusted the mountain. And what do you think?" "I think the mountain has been good to us," I said. "I also think Brenda's knee." Donna went back inside without giving me an answer, which was her way of telling me the decision was mine. I called a meeting that evening, all 9 of us, kitchen table, oil lamp in the center. I told them about the signal. I told them about the coordinates. I told them what Tom had heard. I watched Russell's face when I said this. He was watching Tom's face, and Tom was looking at the table. "Why didn't you tell us?" Boyd said to Tom, with the bluntness of a 22-year-old who hadn't learned yet to frame things carefully. "I was figuring out whether it was worth telling," Tom said. "That's not your call," Russell said, not angry, just, "I know," Tom said. I let that sit for a second and then moved on. "Here's what we know. The signal has been consistent for over a month. It describes a specific number of people and a specific location. The location checks out on my father's map as a reasonable choice for a defensible settlement. Valley floor, 1 road in, Forest Service structure that would be expandable. If it's real, it's a community of 40 people with medical support. If it's not real," I stopped. "If it's not real," Russell said, "somebody is using it to catch people on the road in winter." "Which is why we'd need to go carefully," I said. "Not drive straight there. Approach from a non-obvious direction. Scout before we commit." Russell looked at me. I looked back. "Brenda's knee," I said. He looked at Brenda. She looked back at him, with the specific expression of a person who is tired of being talked about in their presence, and who is also not going to argue about it, because she knows what her knee feels like. "If we go," Russell said, "we go prepared to leave fast." "Yes. And we don't tell them we're from somewhere specific until we know what they are." "Agreed." "And I'm coming," he said. "Not a debate." "Not a debate," I agreed. Dale raised his hand, which no one else at the table had ever done. "I'd like to stay here," he said, "if that's all right. This cabin is... I'd rather hold the place, in case it doesn't work out." I hadn't thought about leaving someone at the cabin, which was stupid of me. If we went and it was wrong, having a place to come back to was the difference between everything and nothing. "Me too," said Boyd, unexpectedly. He looked at his father. "Someone needs to be here." Russell looked at his son for a moment. Something passed across his face that I didn't try to interpret. "Okay," he said. The plan took shape over 3 days of planning. Me, Donna, Ethan, Lily, Tom, Brenda, Russell in the truck. Dale and Boyd at the cabin with enough supplies for a month. The route I'd mapped using my father's paper maps and the Forest Service road information I had from my ranger years. fuel cans enough for the round trip with margin, the two-way radios for communication with Dale. We left on a Tuesday, which I noticed. The drive was 8 hours instead of the theoretical 3 because the roads were what they were, snow-covered, occasionally blocked by abandoned vehicles that we moved with the come-along, and patience, one section where a bridge was out and we spent 40 minutes finding a crossing that worked. Ethan navigated. He'd taken to the paper maps with the same focus he'd given baseball once, which made me feel something I kept not saying. We saw infected twice on the drive, small groups, moving slow in the cold, well off the road. Russell tracked them through his scope until they were out of sight, but they didn't come at the truck. In winter, apparently, the sound of an engine at distance wasn't enough to draw them at speed. The forest road into the Cherokee National Forest was unplowed, but the truck's tires handled it with the chains we'd put on in the morning. 5 miles of this road, then a smaller fire access road, then a gate, Forest Service gate, green, locked, that I opened with a combination I remembered from my ranger years, same institutional inertia as the station, and which should not have worked but did. The valley appeared around a curve in the fire road, and we all saw it at the same time. There were buildings, not the temporary structures you'd imagine for a month-old settlement, but something with more permanence. Forest Service infrastructure that had been expanded with additional structures, some of them fresh timber, some of them repurposed materials. There were lights, electric lights, which meant a generator. There were people moving between the buildings, real people, in ordinary clothes and purposeful motion. There were, by my count before we stopped the truck, roughly 40 people visible. More, probably, inside. Donna made a sound I hadn't heard from her in 4 months. Not quite a word. Okay, I said quietly. We don't assume. We observe first. Nate, she said. I know. Russell had his rifle across his knees. Perimeter, he said, before we drive in. We scouted the valley from the tree line for an hour. The perimeter of the settlement had wire, not a fortified wall, but a clear perimeter. There were 2 people with rifles at visible posts on the eastern approach. There was a channel in the snow that suggested a cleared road or path around the main structures. There was a garden preparation area. Someone had been clearing a south-facing slope, even in December, getting ready for spring planting. There was a medical building, identified by a Red Cross symbol on the door. The people we could see moved with purpose. Not panic, not aggression, just purpose. Russell said, "It's real." I said, "Yeah. Could still be a trap," he said. "But it's not a simple trap. This took work." "Yeah, your call," he said. I looked at Donna. She looked at the medical building. I drove the truck into the valley. The man who came to meet us was named Patrick Sully. He was about 60, with white hair, and the build of a man who'd been athletic in his 50s, and was maintaining it into his 60s by necessity. He wore a Forest Service jacket, the original kind, not our Rangers version, the heavier winter one. He held a coffee mug. He looked at the truck, and then at the people getting out of it, doing the same kind of count I'd done on him. "How many?" he said. 7 in the truck, I said. 2 more at our base, who we radioed last night to let them know we'd arrived. He nodded, looked at Lily, who was holding Donna's hand, and looking at the buildings with an expression I didn't have a word for. "We've got room," he said. "Tight, but room. And medical. We have a doctor, Angie. She's been here from week 2. One of ours has a knee problem," I said. "May need surgery." "Angie trained as an orthopedic surgeon before she did emergency medicine," he said. "I'm not making that up." I looked at him. He looked back at me, with the plain face of a man saying a plain thing. "I'm Nate Calloway," I said. "Former park ranger." "Patrick Sully," he said. "Former state parks director," which is why I knew the access combination to this gate. We shook hands. He looked at Russell. Russell looked at him. "You're military," Patrick said. "Was," Russell said. "We have 4 others who are," Patrick said. "Or were. They'll want to compare notes." He said it the way you say something that's neutral information, and also a slight warning, all in one. Russell nodded once. "Understood." We went in. I want to tell you about the next 6 weeks, which were the strangest period of the whole thing, because they were both better and worse than the mountain cabin in ways I hadn't anticipated. Better, food variety, which sounds small until it's been 4 months of rationed beans and rice and canned corn. Better, other children, which made Lily and Ethan both do a rapid social recalibration that was visible and physical, like muscles remembering their function. Better, Brenda's knee, which Angie assessed and treated with a targeted brace, a specific anti-inflammatory protocol, and physical therapy exercises she supervised 3 times a week, and which began to improve within 2 weeks in ways we could all see. Better, 40 people instead of 9, which changed the weight of things. The feeling of a burden that was being carried by more hands. Worse, 40 people instead of 9, which changed the politics of things. Patrick Sully was a good man. I'm confident in that now, more confident than I was at first. But he ran his community the way a parks director runs a parks department, which is by committee and consensus, and a management structure that was formal enough to have actually been written down. He showed me the document on day 3, a genuine governance structure, typed up by someone and printed on what must have been a nearly empty printer cartridge. It had working groups, it had dispute resolution procedures, it had a food allocation policy, and a work assignment policy, and a security protocol. I'd spent 4 months making decisions quickly with the people I had. Coming into a structure that required formal agreement felt like learning a different language. Russell had the harder time. He looked at the security setup and had opinions about it that he expressed to me privately on the second evening, in a way that was careful and measured, and that I could tell he was working hard to keep private, because he understood that his way of doing things wasn't going to be everyone's way of doing things in a 40-person community with an elected council. Their posts are too visible, he said. I know. Anyone approaching from the ridge can see exactly where the guards are. I know. And the perimeter wire is a good idea, but it doesn't have enough trip systems to give adequate warning time at night. Do you want me to bring it up with Patrick? I'll bring it up with Patrick, he said. You already have goodwill here. I don't have goodwill yet. You'll get it. Eventually, he said, with the patience of a man who'd learned that fast doesn't work everywhere, and that sometimes you have to play a longer game. The thing about Russell, and I'd been waiting to tell you this since I first described him arriving at the cabin, the thing I hadn't been able to identify about him, and that I finally understood about 6 weeks into living in close proximity, was that he was afraid of himself. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that made him dangerous, but in the specific fear of a man who knows exactly what he's capable of under pressure, and who has learned from experience that those capabilities can go wrong in ways that are hard to undo. He'd been careful, all through the mountain winter, to stay in a certain lane: physical work, physical preparation, observation, the things that needed doing without question. He'd deferred to me consistently, even when he thought I was wrong and occasionally told me so, because he understood that the structure of leadership in a small group needed to be clear, or it became contested, and contested leadership in a survival situation was more dangerous than imperfect leadership. It was something he'd been taught, I realized later, taught it or learned it. Either way, he carried it like a tool he'd decided how to use. In Patrick's settlement, he was learning the new lane, and it was slower, but I think it was right. Ethan got into a fight, the 3rd week, with a 15-year-old boy named Garrett, who'd arrived with his mother, and who had the specific aggression of a teenage boy who'd been frightened for 4 months and had no other way to express it. It was a stupid fight, the way those fights are, started by nothing. I heard the second-hand account from 3 people and never got a consistent story about who said what first. And Ethan came out of it with a split lip and a black eye, and the look of a boy who'd won something he wasn't sure he should have wanted. I sat with him that evening and didn't lecture. I'd learned, slowly, that lecturing Ethan was the specific wrong tool for any situation involving Ethan. I just sat with him. He said our group was lucky. He said we'd just been hiding in the woods and it wasn't real, like what his family went through, coming from the city. And I got mad. Yeah. Were we hiding? Is that what it was? I thought about it. The roof. The road barrier. The ranger station run. The man standing in the road who'd turned toward the tree line. The cans rattling in the dark. The LJ run, with 30 figures coming from the south end of town. No, I said. We weren't hiding. He looked at his hands. Okay. You didn't need to hit him, I said. I know. But I understand why you did. He looked at me with that 13-year-old's assessment, checking whether the understanding was real or performed. He seemed to decide it was real. He nodded. His lip healed faster than the situation with Garrett, which took 3 weeks of careful navigating by everyone involved, and eventually resolved into a provisional non-hostility that was the best you could probably get with 2 teenage boys who'd both been through something. Angie, the orthopedic surgeon, sat me down in the second week and asked me questions about what we'd observed in the mountain. The infected, the behavior, the patterns. She was building a medical record, she said, for the settlement's common knowledge. She asked me specific things: the standing behavior, the apparent cold sensitivity, the sensory tracking that Russell and I had observed. I told her all of it. She listened without writing anything down, which was her way. She'd listen to everything and then recall it accurately without notes, a skill I'd only seen in 1 or 2 other people in my life. When I finished, she said, "The sensory tracking is consistent with what 2 other groups have reported to us." "It's consistent with them using smell," I said. "Yes, at least primarily smell, possibly also vibration, ground vibration. Sound and sight seem to be secondary, which is counterintuitive." Why counterintuitive? Because the visual cortex degrades first in the kind of neurological damage we're seeing. The olfactory system is more primitive, more robust. If the damage was selective in a certain way. She stopped. "I'm theorizing. I don't have the equipment to verify." "What does it mean practically?" "Wind direction matters a lot," she said. "Stay downwind, and don't assume that staying still and quiet is sufficient. If you're upwind, stillness doesn't help you." I thought about the 2 figures at the barrier. We'd been downwind that night. The fact that they'd turned toward us had always bothered me, and now I understood it slightly better. We hadn't been fully downwind. There'd been a slight cross-current from the east. "The winter behavior," I said. "The slowing." "Cold affects metabolic rate," Angie said. "Body temperature regulation is heavily dependent on movement in the standard human body. In someone with severely compromised neurological function, that regulation breaks down, and the metabolic slowdown from ambient cold is more pronounced. They're not hibernating, but they're running at a fraction of their normal capacity." "Which means spring. Which means spring will be a problem," she said, completing it without drama. I went back to our assigned space in the settlement. 2 rooms in one of the expanded structures, enough for the 7 of us, and I lay on the bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about spring. February brought the first attempt to breach the settlement's perimeter. It happened at 3 in the morning, which is the time these things apparently prefer. Patrick's security team, 3 people on rotation, picked it up early, which was to their credit, but the response was chaotic enough that Russell sat with Patrick the following morning for 2 hours, and afterward the security protocol was rewritten, with Russell's name on it. There were 9 of them, all infected. They'd come from the south side of the valley, along a creek drainage that ran close to the perimeter wire. The wire had caught them, which was its purpose, but the alarm system was slow. The tripwire was set to a bell, and the bell was at the wrong end of the structure, from where 2 of the 3 guards were stationed. Nobody got hurt. 2 infected were put down. The rest withdrew into the tree line, which they did without apparent communication and without apparent fear, which was its own variety of disturbing. The pattern of withdrawal was what bothered everyone who'd watched it. Not scatter, not random dispersal, but a coordinated pulling back that didn't look like animals running from danger and didn't look like humans making a deliberate choice. It looked like something in between. "They learn routes," Angie said at the morning meeting. "I think they map high-traffic areas over time. They've been here, or nearby before. They know the drainage." "Animals do that." Russell presented his revised security protocol. Patrick adopted it over the objection of 2 council members who felt the increased guard rotation was a labor burden. The objection was noted. The protocol was adopted anyway. It was the first time I watched Patrick override his own governance structure, and the way he did it, not with authority or force, but with a very calm, very final statement about what would happen, told me something about him that I'd been uncertain about until that moment. He was willing to be wrong in process, in order to be right in outcome, which is the distinction between a manager and a leader. I didn't say this to Russell, who already knew it. March arrived, and with March came decisions about the mountain. Dale and Boyd had been in radio contact every 3 days through the winter. Each check-in was brief. They were rationing radio battery, but consistent. Cabin secure, weather holding, supply levels acceptable. One near incident in January, when 3 infected had come up the logging road and tested the barrier for 2 hours before moving on. Boyd had not engaged them, which was the right decision, and which I told him through the radio. In March, Dale's check-in was different. "There's more of them," he said. "In the valley, I can see from the roof. The warmer days, they're moving more." How many more? Hard to say. More than before winter. Maybe twice. I thought about the spring Angie had warned about. Are the barrier systems holding? So far. But Nate, he paused. The radio hissed. "There's a group of people, not infected, on the county road. 2 vehicles. They've been there for 3 days. Can't tell if they're heading up this road or just stopped." "Watching them?" "Yeah. Don't engage," I said. "Just watch." "Okay." I went to find Patrick. The cabin was a resource. The spring, the root cellar, the fortifications, the firewood supply, the stored ammunition. It was a base that was closer to the roads, closer to the valley resources, in a different terrain than the forest settlement. There had been, in the settlement's planning discussions that winter, a conversation about satellite locations, smaller outposts that could extend the community's reach and provide fallback positions. The cabin fit that model. I said this to Patrick. I said we needed to bring Dale and Boyd back in, properly resupply the cabin, and potentially establish it as a formal satellite, with a rotating presence rather than just 2 people alone. Patrick listened. "What would it take?" he said. 2 more adults, medical supplies, fuel, enough for the generator through spring. A proper radio, not the handheld we've been using. "We can do most of that," he said. "The 2 adults is a question of who's willing." "I know who I'd ask," I said. Russell asked Patty first. She said yes before he finished the sentence. They'd been in the settlement 3 months, and Patty had been quietly, relentlessly useful. She organized the food preparation system into something better than what had existed. She helped with the children's informal schooling that Patrick had started organizing. She did all of this with the specific competence of a woman who had always done things competently and never needed to be told she was doing well. But she'd been restless. I could see it without her saying it. The settlement was good, but it was also 40 people in close quarters, which produced friction in the way that any group of 40 people does, and Patty had never been a crowd person. Russell said he wanted to go back to the mountain for the spring, for the space, for the observation post, for the ability to watch what was happening in the valley as the weather changed. Patrick understood and agreed. The night before they left, I sat with Russell at the fire the settlement maintained in a central pit, the kind that burned low for warmth rather than high for display. I said, "What were you afraid of?" He looked at me, knew what I was asking about. "In the Marines," he said. "One specific deployment. I won't go into it, but the things I did in that deployment were defensible. Nobody found anything wrong with them. And I found things wrong with them. And you thought you might do those things again. I thought I might, and not find anything wrong with them this time," he said, "which is the worse version." I looked at the fire. "You didn't." "Not yet." "Russell, you didn't." He was quiet for a while. Then, "You never asked me to account for the extra ammunition I found at the mining shack. You let me manage it. You managed it well. You gave me something to be in charge of that wasn't other people," he said. "I know you did it on purpose." I thought about denying it. Didn't. Yeah. He almost smiled again. The same one as back in week 1. He and Patty left the following morning in their truck with supplies and the proper radio and 2 other volunteers who'd decided they wanted the satellite assignment. A woman named Claire who'd been a veterinary technician and who had a specific form of practical medical competence that would be useful, and her partner, a quiet guy named Jeff who'd worked in sustainable agriculture and who, given April planting season on the horizon, might be the most valuable person I could have put at the cabin. Dale cried when he saw Russell's truck come up the logging road. I didn't see it, he told me later, but he didn't seem embarrassed about it either. Boyd and his father had a conversation I wasn't party to. Boyd came back to the settlement with us. He seemed lighter for it. April. Spring in the Blue Ridge is the most convincing argument the world makes for itself. Things come back that looked finished. The hemlocks lose their dusty winter look. The deciduous trees put out that new leaf yellow-green that's the most specific color in nature. The forest fills in from every side simultaneously, as if on a schedule, which it is. The creek below the settlement ran high and fast with snowmelt. Birds appeared in the settlement's trees. Real birds. Not the absent silence of last September, but actual birds, whose absence over the previous winter, I'd finally understood, was them leaving, moving away from a threat that had changed the territory, and whose return might mean something, or might mean nothing. And the infected moved faster. Angie had been right. April brought them back at nearly the previous speed, and by the middle of the month we had confirmed sightings of groups on both the eastern and western approaches to the valley. Not yet at the perimeter, but at distances that required calculation rather than assumption. Russell radioed from the cabin. They're in the valley below in numbers I haven't seen, he said. Moving patterns. Might be 300, might be more. They're congregating near Hatchet Creek. 300 was a number that changed the calculation for the settlement. Not immediately, not this month, but the directional math of a congregation that large was uncomfortable if you thought it through. Patrick called a full community meeting on a Thursday evening. All 46 people, in the main hall, which was the largest of the Forest Service buildings, and which could fit everyone if nobody needed personal space, which they didn't. He laid out the situation. The satellite cabin reporting increased numbers to the south. Angie's assessment of spring behavior. The settlement's current defensive capacity, which Russell had improved significantly, but which had a limit that Russell had also been honest about. The supply situation, which was better than it had been in February, but had a horizon. I want to hear what people think, Patrick said. People said things. Some of it was useful, and some of it was fear, wearing the clothes of an argument. A man named Gene, who'd been at the settlement from month 1, and who had a specific authority from that seniority, said they should fortify and hold. A woman named Deborah, who'd arrived in February with 3 children, and who had quickly become one of the most organized people in the settlement, said they needed to think about a secondary location, something further from the valley, higher up. I said, "We have a high location." Everyone looked at me. "The cabin," I said. "It's 1,200 feet higher than this valley. The spring behavior we're seeing in the valley isn't the same at that elevation. Russell's reports consistently show fewer and slower activity at altitude." "The cabin holds maybe a dozen people comfortably," Patrick said. "We're 46. The cabin holds a dozen people in the structures we have now," I said. "With the timber on that property, and the tools we have, and the labor of 46 people working through the spring and summer, we could expand it significantly." Silence. "You're talking about moving the whole settlement," Patrick said. "I'm talking about having a fallback," I said. "If this valley becomes untenable, which it might not, but if it does," Patrick thought about it. He didn't give an answer that night, but he sat with me after the meeting and said, "Take me there." I drove Patrick to the cabin in April. On the way up the logging road, I showed him the barrier. He studied it, with the systematic attention he brought to everything, and said it was the right design for the terrain. Inside the cabin, he went through the root cellar and the spring system, and the expanded structure that Russell and Jeff had begun building off the north wall. They'd started a bunkhouse addition, rough timber, that would add sleeping space for 6. He stood on the roof. I'd taken him up to show him the valley view, and looked south. 300, Russell had said. Maybe more. Patrick looked for a long time. How high a percentage of that group do you think would come up this mountain? He said. Not a question exactly. In winter, almost none. In summer, I paused. If something loud happened down there, something that drew them, and then gave them direction, a large enough source of sound and scent, they'd follow it. So don't be loud. Right. Which is what you did the whole first winter. Yes. He turned from the view, looked at the cabin, the additions, the reinforced porch, the lean-to, the log barrier half a mile down the road. We could expand the fortifications before we move anyone, he said. Use the summer, while the valley settlement still holds. Build this location up. Then, if we need to, we have somewhere to go, I said. He was quiet for a while, doing the calculations that leaders do, the ones that are mostly about people rather than numbers. Your father built this, he said. He built it, and he left it to me. He had good judgment. He did, I said. Patrick looked at me. I think I know why you left the Rangers. Oh yeah? Because you can see things from elevation that you can't see from inside them. And you got tired of trying to explain what you could see. That sat with me. Still sits. Maybe, I said. We drove back down the mountain. We spent the summer doing both things at once, which was the right answer, even though it was the harder answer. The valley settlement stayed functional, maintained, defended, because 46 people had built something there that wasn't nothing, and the mountain cabin grew, not fast, because we had other things to do, but steadily, the way things grow when people care about them and know why. Jeff, who'd been a sustainable agriculture person, started a garden on the south slope of the mountain in May. Not the ambitious kind of garden that collapses under its own planning, the simple kind, the things that grow in these mountains without requiring much from you. Potatoes, which are the right crop for this soil and this climate. Kale, a bean variety Jeff had brought in seed packets he'd carried from the settlement like they were documents. Squash. Garlic that he planted in November of the previous year had already come up. Small green spears through the late snow. Lily helped him. She'd decided Jeff was the most interesting person in her current world, and she was not wrong. Jeff had the quality of knowing things that were genuinely useful and of explaining them in a way that made you feel like you were discovering them rather than being told them. She came in every evening with dirt on her knees and specific information about potato plants that nobody had asked for, but that I listened to fully, every time. Ethan had started doing something I hadn't asked him to do and hadn't expected. He'd been going out with the perimeter checks, at first with Russell, and then sometimes by himself, with a notebook. He was mapping things. The infected movements he'd observed, the times, the routes, the groups. He had a method, symbols for direction, numbers for apparent size, weather conditions noted in shorthand he'd developed himself. He showed me the notebook one evening without being asked, which was different from Ethan showing me anything about anything, and I looked at 3 weeks of data and felt something that I had to take a moment to be alone to manage. He was doing what I used to do as a ranger. He was reading a territory. This is good, Ethan, I said. I thought maybe you could use it, to figure out the patterns. I can. It helps. He nodded, put the notebook away, went back to whatever else he was doing, which was also the right thing to do with something you've just been told is good. The infection patterns Ethan was tracking matched what Angie had observed, and Russell had reported, and that I'd been building my own observations around since the standing man on the logging road. The groups in the valley moved in circuits. The same circuits, repeated, with variations that corresponded to weather, temperature, and what I could only call social dynamics. One group joining or following another, splitting, reconvening. They weren't random. They weren't planned. But they weren't random. I showed Ethan's notebook to Angie in June, when she came up from the settlement for a consultation visit with Brenda, whose knee was good enough now that she was running operations at the settlement's medical station with Angie as senior advisor. Angie looked at the notebook for a long time. He's identified 3 circuit routes, she said. Yes? If you could predict the circuits, you could move in the gaps between them, I said. Supply runs, communication runs, safer routes. How old is he? 13, I said. He'll be 14 in August. She looked at me. He's going to be important to what comes next. I hadn't thought about what came next in those terms. In those terms, what came next was the community of people figuring out how to live in a world that had fundamentally changed. And the people who would figure it out best were probably not the ones who had the most weapons or the best fortifications, though those mattered. They were the people who learned to read the new territory. July was when we found the other cabin. Not found. I knew it was there, or that something was there, from my father's maps. He'd noted a second structure about 2 miles north along the ridge, something he described as an old trapper's cabin, abandoned. His notation saying, occupied recently? Unclear. He'd made that note about 3 years before he died, and I'd never had a reason to investigate it. We investigated it in July because Jeff had found a trail running north that he'd been curious about, and that led him, over 2 days of casual exploration, to a flat area on the ridge where the cabin was. It was occupied, not by infected, by a woman named Gloria Trent, who was 68 years old, who had been living in that 2-room trapper's cabin since October, longer than we'd been on the mountain, longer than the settlement in the valley, entirely alone. She had survived alone in a 2-room cabin with a wood stove and a hand-dug well and a garden she'd started before the world had changed, and that she'd tended through the chaos with the specific stubbornness of a person who'd been tending gardens her entire life and saw no reason to stop. She had 68 years of food preservation knowledge, a cellar under the cabin floor, 3 cats who were useless in practical terms, and who she referred to by name without apology, and a .22 rifle, with which she'd been dealing with certain problems in ways she described with complete matter-of-factness. She also had a library, not metaphorically. A real library, 200 and some books, piled on every available surface, organized in a system only she understood, covering subjects that ranged from practical mountain skills, to history, to poetry, to 3 separate books about beekeeping, which had become relevant because she had 2 hives that had survived the winter, which meant she had honey, which meant she had a trade good that was more valuable than most of what we had. Jeff found her in her garden, and she looked up at him and said, "You're from down the mountain." "How'd you know?" he'd asked. "Because you're wearing shoes that aren't worn out yet," she said. "Nobody alone on a mountain for 8 months has shoes that good." I went back with Jeff to meet her, and Donna came too, because Donna has better instincts for people than I do, and I trust her assessments. Gloria made tea, actual tea. She had dried herbs, and we sat in her 2-room cabin, surrounded by books and cats, and the specific smell of a wood-burning stove in summer, which is different from winter, and we talked for 3 hours. Donna liked her immediately. Not performed liking, actual liking. They talked about gardening, and then about food preservation, and then about things that weren't practical at all. And at one point, I looked at Donna's face and saw something there that I hadn't seen since before Atlanta, since before the apartment and the commute and the wearing down. She was fully there, not managing anything, just talking to a person she found interesting. Gloria said, "About the infected, they avoid my clearing." "Why?" I said. "The cats," she said. "The cats. Not because the cats do anything. But the cats have been here the whole time, and their smell is all through this clearing. I don't know if this is right, but I think they recognize a territory that's already claimed. By something that isn't them. The cats smell like predators to them, or like something, and they stay at the edge." I thought about this. Animal smell, territory marking, a primitive layer of behavior that responded to primitive signals. "Have you tested it?" I said. "Not on purpose, but the 3 times they've come close to the clearing, they stopped at the tree line and didn't come in." I said. That was the only response I had, which was that it was interesting information I didn't know what to do with yet. I told Angie about it in August. She filed it with the other observations and said, "We're building a picture." What does the picture show so far? That they're adapting, she said. Not dramatically, not in ways that suggest anything like cognition, but they're adapting to the territory the same way animals do, avoiding threats they've learned about, following circuits they've found successful, responding to sensory cues we don't fully understand yet. Is that getting worse over time? I think the adaptive learning stabilizes, she said. The neurological damage is progressive, but the base behaviors become stable once the damage plateaus. I think the worst case we'll see in terms of adaptation is probably what we're already seeing. That's the optimistic version. Yes, she said. I'm working on the pessimistic version, but I'd rather wait for more data before I present it. Late August. Almost a year. Lily turned 9 on a Thursday in late August, and Donna made a cake from the first year's potato flour we'd processed. Not a great cake. The potato flour was dense, and the honey substituted for sugar didn't quite work the same way, but a cake regardless. With 9 candles that were actual birthday candles from a box Donna had packed in Atlanta 11 months ago because she was the kind of person who thought to pack birthday candles. Lily blew them out in one breath. Ethan made her a card. Not a bought card, a made one, from paper he'd found in the cabin's supply of old notebooks, with a drawing on it that was genuinely good, a picture of the cabin, with the mountain above it, and a small figure in the garden that was recognizably Lily, down to the way she stood when she was working, with her hip cocked and one hand shading her eyes. I didn't know he could draw. He'd never told anyone he could draw. That's beautiful, Donna said, looking at it. It's okay, he said. Ethan, it's beautiful. He shrugged, which was his way of accepting a compliment, and went to cut the first piece of the bad cake. I stood on the porch that evening and thought about the Tuesday we'd arrived, the 26 hours before, the roof I'd patched and the spring I'd cleaned, and the dinner of peanut butter sandwiches, and my father's 2 strong coffee, the name tag on Lily's door, in red marker with a flower. Donna came out and stood beside me. Below, the valley was doing its late summer thing, the light going golden through the haze that was partly distance, and partly August, and partly the smoke that still rose occasionally from places that had burned and hadn't stopped burning. The settlement was down there. 46 people, now 49 with the arrivals in July, in structures they'd built and expanded and argued over and maintained through a winter and a spring and a summer. Russell's revised security protocol. Tom's radio log, more organized now. 2 months of signals he'd identified and mapped. Angie's picture. Building. The mountain above was the mountain. The same thing my father had lived under for 9 years. The same sky that forgot you were there. What are you thinking? Donna said. I'm thinking about next year, I said. Good things or bad things? Both, I said. More on the good side. She put her arm through mine. We stood there while the light went out of the valley, and the first stars came through, the same excessive number, still more than Atlanta had ever allowed. We're okay, she said. Not a question. We're okay, I said. From somewhere down the hill, through the trees where the garden sat in its late summer abundance, we could hear Lily and Jeff talking about something. Their voices too far to make out the words, just the rhythm. The back and forth of something being explained and something being understood. The forest wasn't silent anymore, hadn't been for months. The birds had come back. The squirrels were doing what squirrels do in late summer, which is be loud and frantic about acorns in a way that communicates something about time. Somewhere on the ridge above, something large moved through underbrush, unhurried. I didn't try to identify it. It was just the mountain, doing what mountains do, which is continue. And I was here to notice it, which was more than I'd been certain of, once, on more than one occasion. My father's notebook was in my jacket pocket. I carried it most places now. Not to read, usually. I'd read it enough times to know it, just to carry. The way you carry something that belongs to both the present and the past, that connects one version of you to another, that says, somebody did this work before you, and they left you the tools. The night settled in. Below, the valley was quiet in the way it had been quiet all summer. Not the wrong silence of September. Not the absence of everything. but the quiet of things going on in the dark that weren't interested in being observed. The infected moved in their circuits. The settlement held its perimeter. The logging road barrier sat in the dark of the mountain, solid and patient. And up here, on the porch, two people who had been tired in their bones for a long time, who had come up a mountain for reasons they hadn't quite admitted to each other, who had found that the mountain didn't care what they'd brought with them, or what they were running from, and who were still here. Still here. Donna went in to check on the kids. I stayed on the porch until full dark. Then I went inside too. Pulled the door closed behind me. The latch caught with the specific click of a door that had been hung right by someone who knew what they were doing, decades before I arrived.